Can you say hi? Very nice to see you all this afternoon, and welcome to Melly. My name is Gabi Ngobo. I'm the director at Melly. Thank you for gathering with us on this occasion of the Symposium, Small Archives Thinking Collectively, conceptualized by Marlene Koch, our archivist and curator of the exhibition 35 Years of Mind and Matter. The exhibition is an invitation for us to re-listen to our own institutional voice, to recognize its power, to embrace its doubts, its moments of stutter, its echoes, and all the contradictions contained within it. Small in this instance doesn't mean to be demeaning, but rather to indicate that these institutional archives are usually run by one or two people, with archiving as one task among several and or as a part-time position. Marlene will say more about that in her introduction. My task today is to welcome you and to welcome our speakers and to wish you all fruitful discussions that can hopefully lead to more connections, collaboration, sharing of knowledge and resources. I'm happy to welcome Clémentine Deliss, our keynote speaker, and a long-time friend of mine and collaborator as well, and our speakers from institutions from the Netherlands who share the same idea of a small archive as defined by Marlene. Nell Donkers from the Appel, EV Events from Framer Framed, Isabel Surley from A Tale of a Tub, and Maria Lanari and Remco van Bladel from Archive Consciousness. This symposium takes place towards the end of our year-long celebration of 35 years of our presence in the art ecosystem of Rotterdam. On the 27th of November, in fact, we will launch a newly revamped awards program, the Mellys, as well as an exhibition by Marilyn Nance opening on the 13th of December. Marilyn Nance's exhibition, Spirit, Faith, Grace, Rage, shows us also how an artist has organized their personal archive to encounter or to counter narratives emerging from state and colonial archives, keeping her archive safe, organizing it, and making it accessible. And I hope we will see you or you will be able to visit the exhibition after the 13th or on the 13th of December. I welcome you all and I wish you a great symposium. I'll hand over to Marlene.
Welcome everybody by Small Archives Thinking Collectively. This symposium was thought of as a way to combine all the knowledge of the archivists of the small archives, but also to sort of make a dialogue happen, because the problem with small archives or like working on your own little island within an institute is that you often don't talk about the archival nitty-gritty because your colleagues are in different places. I always say when the exhibitions ends, then my work starts, while the other people are then already moving on to the next project. So I thought it would be nice if we came together as archivists in all kinds of forms and matter, but also people who want to start making archives. So we also invited guests from MAMA and from the New Institute and from Dance. We have people, for the people who don't know Dance, because that's for non-archivists, maybe not as clear. It's like the National Digital Archive for culture. So there's all kinds of angles, and I hope we can all also speak to each other in the breaks and the drinks afterwards. So that's more of the atmosphere of the symposium, is to enjoy each other's company and learn something along the way. I will introduce now the speaker, the keynote speaker, Clémentine Deliss. I will not tell her her bio, because that's on our website, but I thought it would be more interesting to know why I invited her. She is the head curator of KANAL-Centre Pompidou, which is to be opened in 2026. But when I started this symposium, I started also thinking a bit small, and then Gabi, our director, said, think big and invite anyone you want, as long as they're from Europe. And somebody said to me, like, you will like Clémentine Deliss. And this happened long before I was thinking about the symposium. So I had her on my list of people who I found interesting, and I've downloaded some of her. Yeah, I know it's illegal. I downloaded some of her books, especially Foreign Exchange, which she did as a director at the Weltkultur. Yeah, I always say it the wrong way around. Weltkulturen Museum in Frankfurt am Main, and there she invited artists into the museum, and she also did a lot of conversations with them, and those conversations were interesting because they were talking not only about difficult collections, but they were also talking about what do you document, what do you not document, how do you sort of archive, so more the meta level of archiving. And then I also read Skin in the Game, which is a recently published book, which you can buy in the store. And that's a book about like the Metabolic Museum, which he did in Berlin. And there also she invited artists to talk about the moment that they really put their skin in the game when making an exhibition, and especially female artists. And in that book, there's also an interview with Joëlle Tuurlings. And she is the first artist I saw at Witte de Wit then, now Kunstinstituut Melly. And for me, that made a circle round. So I think it's nice to sort of have Clémentine make a more theoretical position about archiving. And then afterwards, I will introduce the other ones who are more practical in their approach. So, Clémentine, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. That's a wonderful introduction. Thank you, Marjolein. And thank you, first of all, to the Kunstinstituut Melly, to Gabi Ngobo. Did I do it right? I did, huh? Who I also invited at the time to the Weltkulturen Museum, and who did a fantastic exhibition together with Yvette Mutumba called A Labor of Love. Thank you to Line, and to Vincent, and to everybody here for this very nice introduction and welcome. I haven't been here since 2009. I took part in the Morality Conference at the time, 2009 or 2010. And so I never work in Holland. For me, it's very different, very uncharted territory. Not for wanting to, not for a couple of times applying for jobs in Amsterdam, but so it's great to be here tonight. And what I would like to talk to you about are some thoughts. I'm not going to give you like a sort of full down, kind of like take you through exhibitions and tell you how I do things like that. I want to raise some questions today, which may or may not fit to small archives thinking collectively. It's up to you to tell me if it makes sense. I was given a certain freedom of movement, and so let's see what happens. I've always wondered about that one cardboard box that an employee fills with their papers and belongings when they are fired from an office. It's an iconic scene. But how is it that engagement and achievement in an institution can be reduced to such a small container? A pencil sharpener, a few ballpoint pens, pads, a stapler, the odd knick-knack that sits above a monitor and acts as a reminder of self. All this trivia epitomizes a person's daily presence. The cardboard box is a storage unit of a working life, but it's neither an archive nor a collection. Rather, it functions as a jumbled synecdoche for the nature of proprietorship. All files, documents, texts, and images produced by the employee are by ruling not theirs. Everything outside the contents of the box is owned by the company or the institution. That scene in which an individual picks up their belongings and leaves is the performative enactment of a particular expression of contractual imbalance. Small Boxes is a text that I've been working on for a while, and I go back to it every now and again, and it builds a counterpoint to my work as an independent curator, whose archive is her own responsibility, and who, for reasons unknown, to me anyhow, spends most of the time investigating collections that are neglected. So the opposite of the small box, I focus on those huge archives held onto by the state, by municipalities, and that are the result of 19th century science, extractivism, and pillaging. So do these archives, I wonder, today, and you really get the impression sometimes walking in the cities of Europe, in particular in Brussels where I work, that if I tapped hard on the pavement and opened it up, I would just see a kind of a mass of collected material. There's so much, there's so many museums, there's so many things, but we rarely see them. So do these collections and archives have the potential today to become tools of civic knowledge and education? And I believe they do, and that institutions have a duty to provide access to these holdings. Right? We're in the Kunstinstituut Melly, and there's a very good exhibition on the third floor, but it's not stuff, right? It's archival, it's boxes, it's anyhow. So how do we balance the absent archives of working people and the institutional hoarding of museums? I didn't sleep much last night probably because I pulled out these photographs from nearly 40 years ago when I went to the Musée de l'Homme and did field work to understand the relationship between what is called today artistic research. Nobody called it artistic research in the 80s. It was just being a good artist, pretty much, or one part of being an artist. 90% of the work of an artist was doing this research, which you didn't display necessarily, or it actually became part of the work. And I was working on how artists do research and how anthropologists do research, and I ended up rummaging around in the Musée de l'Homme at the time when Deliss was still alive, Michel Deliss, and this is a mask he had brought back from the Mission Dakar Djibouti. And so in preparing this talk today, I wanted to understand, I'm telling you about small boxes and the effacement of the worker in an institution. I wanted to kind of make it quite subjective and talk to you about this problem of each of us and our archives, because it'll come back later. So I'm going to talk about a modus operandi that engages with a fracturing of the disciplinary straitjackets of context that define archives, collections, and their respective institutions, whatever their scale. So I'm going to propose a kind of academic iconoclasm. I'm very wary of the power wielded through a reference to a disciplinary context. How can we break down the discursive and taxonomic systems tied to collections and archives, especially when these systems permeate the very subjects and disciplines of higher education? In other words, you've got a wannabe student who wants to study at university, and even if there are newfangled modules that allow them to kind of move between different courses, they're still going to be confronted with disciplinary divisions that are inherited from the colonial period, if not earlier, but are formatted during that period. So how do we transgress this? How do we mess it up a little bit in order to rethink the option of if you like, a proliferation of meanings rather than a narrowing them down based on specialisms? Are there methods we can use to transgress the borders drawn up in academia so that a new form of semantic flourishing across fields and disciplines can take place? Poaching. Poaching is a method suggested by Michel de Certeau in relation to reading, but it can be adapted to the gaze of the visitor in a museum. Certeau speaks of the traveling eye that, while wandering through an imposed system, engages with a drifting and takes imaginary or meditative flights. He contrasts drifting in an act of reading to, I quote, the militarily organized surfaces of the text. End of quote. So poaching is possible if one changes. So poaching in a collection, archive, museum context is possible if we change, or if we think of the visitor less as a consumer than as per se a student, and per se, maybe following Moten and Harney, a kind of an illegal researcher. It's their right to transgress whatever border they want to transgress. Poaching implies a quasi-anarchic, singular, and disorderly method based on endless dialogues rather than a mono-perspectival viewpoint. So rather than suffocate or obscure the scopic pulsion, which is a crazy term that I came across recently, in other words, the desire to see that is generated by art, right? I would say that art generates a scopic pulsion, not only scopic, but also poaching introduces a transgressive act within the visitor's apprehension of an exhibition and therefore their reliance on context. Poaching is possible if one changes the denomination of the public. Oh, I've just said that. Why am I going back? Okay, I suddenly doubled up my talk. Okay, no worries. I showed you a very beautiful, here, I showed you a very beautiful magazine from the 1920s, which is an Armenian women's magazine, and I worked very intensively in Armenia in 2016 and 17. And then when I wanted to mediate what I was doing in the village where I was, a small town where I was working, I went to the archive, which was in the women's run library, and I produced a newspaper in Armenian, which was printed in the local printers and then driven by bus and thrown onto the roundabout and then distributed to 500 families in Dilijan. And I wanted just to show you how that's kind of the poaching on the one hand with this woman and the gun and whatever she's shooting at, but equally the option of poaching an existing organ. We have the word the organs, or the organ is really important in this case because it's not a cosmetic operation. It's something where the archive suddenly becomes a really active generator of mediation. So what I'm showing you here is an exercise in poaching that my students produced in 2019 in Karlsruhe and then in Ljubljana. And it's basically where they decided to build metabolic chairs that would allow people to sit down and work in a museum, because you can't usually work in a museum. We'll see why later. But to have the option also of spamming the hang, in other words, of projecting your own material from Instagram, from wherever, from the web, in between pictures. So what happens there? This is a classic case of poaching, because what happens is that the eye cannot, you can't just twist a screw in your head and say, okay, just look at what I'm projecting up on that wall. You're immediately looking at things all around at the same time. And so you are transgressing the borderline of one artwork, one curatorial dogma, if you like, if you allow the visitor to project and auto-curate their own material. And so inevitably, it's possible, I mean, this isn't science, but it's possible that the punter who comes into the museum and uses a metabolic chair is more likely to gain an understanding of the two paintings or the three paintings on the wall than if they were just reading a text and then walking past. And this is what I'm interested in, is this kind of nature of the squatting of a civic educational space, i.e. a museum. On the right-hand side, then, you have another case of the metabolic chair being used to literally work inside the museum. Remember one important thing. Of the 3 civic institutions that we have today, the Art Academy, the university, and the museum is the only place that nobody asks you if you are literate and if you have an exam. You can walk in, yes, you may have to pay 20 euros even, but no one is going to ask you if you're educated. Whereas for somebody to go and want to study or teach in a university or an art school, if you don't have the requisite exams, tough. You're not going to be able to do it. And just think about that, what that means in the political conditions in which we live today. But before we go any further, I mean, collections, archives, holdings, there's so few words actually to describe it. It's very hard to get away from this word collection or archive. Holding is a strange thing. It's as if you're holding onto something. It doesn't really work. What is the difference between them? Is it an illusion to make this distinction? I mean, we're talking paperwork, records, files, photographs, things, objects, memories, artworks, paintings, paraphernalia. They're all representations of lived experience that are dynamic, problem-oriented, creative, both very abstract and very real at once. They may be dormant, but they can become alive if they're opened up to new systems of interpretation, alternative ontologies, epistemes, and even functions. In Mal d'Archives, une impression freudienne, from 1995, Jacques Derrida writes, I quote, "The archive, if we want to know what this will have meant, we will only know tomorrow. Perhaps a spectral messianicity is at work in the concept of the archive. And like religion, like history, like science itself, this ties it to a very singular experience of the promise. And we should maybe think about this complex notion of the promise. This is the archives or the storing system at the Weltkulturen Museum in Frankfurt, which I took over for 5 years in order to kind of understand how you could change working with collections and change the disposition of a museum. So rather than go to a contemporary art museum and do something that I wanted to do, I took on the non-redemptive museum par excellence, the museum that has no right to exist any longer, but who holds on to probably the most important collections today. There is nothing more important than the material that was collected like, or beschlagnahmt in German, because I often think of these expeditions of anthropologists as if they were bailiffs. I come back to it again. You know, they would walk into your house. They took everything, your pots, your pans, your bed, your altar, your clothing, everything. They needed to reproduce back in Europe the ways of functioning, the mind, the indigenous mind, so to speak, in order to govern. And this extraordinary attempt to remove everything that belongs to the life of the other means that these collections are just like banks of stored code. We only see a tiny amount, right? I don't need to tell you what. But the real material that should be reworked and understood in today's context is not made accessible. And sadly, not enough people demonstrate towards this phenomenon. You do not see people squatting the entrance of or the collections of an ethnographic museum. Art students continue to believe that it isn't their problem. Yeah. So, you know, when you have an archive like that, then clearly, and you don't know what's in it, you have to rely on the custodian or the conservator, who comes, of course, from a particular school of anthropology, in the German case, historicist, and who will have 15,000 objects to look after, of which they may have some favorite pieces. So when you bring somebody like Gabi or an artist into a storage space like that, you are disrupting the trajectory that will lead you or lead the museum to propose exhibitions that are standard, that are conservative, that are conventional. I'd like to show you a 6-minute film by the Nigerian-British artist Onyeka Igwe. It was then, if you like, extended to a 20-minute film and produced by KW in Berlin. But I want to show you No Archive Will Restore You. It's shot in Lagos in the former Nigerian Film Unit, which was one of the very first self-directed outposts of the British visual propaganda engine, which was called the Colonial Film Unit and existed between 1932 and 1955. So if we could now play Onyeka's film.
Also produce natural gas and other resources such as oil.
What then are we in Africa for? What object brings us here? What main purpose keeps us in Africa? Commerce, gentlemen. Commerce brought us to Africa. Commerce keeps us in Africa.
Before one to be for West to find something. Okay.
Onyeka Igwe was influenced at the time by a book that just came out by Julieta Singh. You maybe know it, I don't know, called No Archive Will Restore You. And in it, Singh writes that the archive is, I quote, an enabling fiction. It's very interesting, this idea. We had promise in the beginning, and now this idea of an enabling fiction. It is the thing, she says, that you say you are doing well before you are actually doing it, and well before you understand what the stakes are of gathering and interpreting it. So she talks in her book about how graduate students, they have their archive. Their studies are suddenly the beginning of an archive. And she's pointing, if you like, to the speculative empowerment of archival work. The archive becomes a channel for self-education and artistic research. It forms itself as one defines it. In other words, it has a certain recursivity to it. It's an adaptive process. It doesn't stay as it is, it changes. But a collection, in contrast, is the hideous accumulation of things, more often associated, perhaps, with power, capital, and domination, however deeply idiosyncratic and anomalous. There is no legitimate concept for a collection. There's no good collection, just like there really isn't a bad collection. It's all a bit crazy to say that. But if you think about it, prehistory, archaeology, anthropology, art history, all of these are disciplines which juggle with the arbitrary and the intentional, the mass collection with the masterpiece, and produce a heck of a lot of kleptomania. Generally speaking, a collector will want to have more rather than less. And maybe the bulk of a collection is the first degree of difference between the archive and the collection. I'm working with many museums in Brussels at the moment, and these are two shots of one which is called La Fonderie, the Museum of Industry and Work, which is actually a huge warehouse covered with cages that all have museum on them, museum, and are, generally speaking, completely inaccessible because they're covered with asbestos, which is probably the fate of this particular museum, but I would hesitate to guess that many museum collections are covered with asbestos or other toxins. In the past, collecting was about founding and building museums, institutes of learning, and establishing scientific disciplines. Museums and university departments favored, in the words of the brilliant Wole Soyinka, species narcissism. I love it. And the disciplinary expertise and authority that went with this form of species narcissism. The control and reification of knowledge production was favored in contrast to an alternative architectonic and civic structure that would actively support indeterminacy, caused by the circulation of collections and the granting of structures and methods that would promote greater accessibility. How hard is it to get into the reserves of a collection? So I look to you all today for us to talk at some point and for you to give me feedback on this question. Is the archive simply less cumbersome, intellectually, ethically, and physically? Is it really more emancipatory? Why can collections not offer this emancipation? Is it really down to the thingness of them and the power of conservation, the ideology of conservation? So we have all these collections and archives, and we want them to transgress borders erected in the 19th century, but there are still a few key issues at stake, which I'd like to address. The first one is what I call collection vanitas. My collection is better than yours, right? Remember, Achille Mbembe once said a fantastic line, "Europe is a lovely museum waiting for the end of the world." So the narcissism around heritage, in quotes, is generated in the way a museum collection reflects upon itself and is conceived of as inalienable, priceless, timeless, outstanding, exceptional, and incapable of being deaccessioned. Something, in other words, to be kept in a quasi-cryonic state for at least 1,000 years to come. It is something that cannot, by definition, be altered or shared. Now, just to give you an example, in the Baroque collections in Kassel, which I visited with my students, we had asked the curator there, did he have any paintings or any objects or sculptures that he was unable to show? And of course he thought, oh, because it might represent colonialism, he went in that direction. And then suddenly he pulled out these paintings, which are bedroom paintings, and there were 60 of them. And clearly they're too far gone to restore. And he said to us, well, we can't show them. It's impossible to show this. They're not of high enough quality. In fact, I couldn't even sell them. Nobody would take them away. I would take it away straight away. I mean, I'd have no problem with... And my students, their eyes popped out of their heads, and they were like, oh my God, there was a kind of... bildnerische Logik, in the words of Böhm, a kind of immediate new imagistic logic which let them see these paintings in connection to maybe, I don't know, the pathology of grafts, of cosmetic surgery, or maybe much more discursively seen the breakdown of the epidermis of art history. But these were paintings, if you like, that no museum will want to show because their collection vanitas would look blighted if they showed this kind of work. It wouldn't bode well for the conservation of that particular institution. Now, an antidote to collection vanitas is, I think, to work on the dissolution or to suspend normative forms of narratology and archiving. So in other words, to fracture biographies. I'll show you how that works in a minute. To extend provenance, to just like it, let it flow into another area, add material onto it. Fictionalize provenance, which already in the case of anthropology is highly fictionalized anyway. We're used to looking at Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulation. Every graduate student comes up with critical fabulation. But how can we go even further and create a kind of archival iconoclasm? Not a cosmetic action, but something that engages with the very flesh of knowledge. The collection then gets removed from its heteronormative context. It requires a transposition. And you have that already with Onyeka Igwe's film. And Onyeka belongs to a group called BASE. They're a collective of which attempt to queer the archive. But Preciado, Paul B. Preciado in 2018 said, I quote him, "How to queer the museum? What does the artist do here? Art needs to trouble normative aesthetics. No art can be outside of politics. And we face the challenge today to change the epistemology of the museum, to open up the code of the museum." Now, what you see here is a beautiful work by Pélagie Baguidi, which is a trapped taxonomic index card system. So she's taken a series of index cards which she's drawn over. They refer to a collection of African works. And then following Marcel Broter's Pense Bête, she's clamped them in plaster. And it's a fantastic piece it evokes both the trap of the taxonomic system, but also the trapping of taxonomy. Now, Walter Benjamin once said that the true method of making things present is to represent them in our space and not to represent ourselves in their space, which would be, in many ways, the classic case of the ethnographic present. And it suggests that we need to render contemporaneous all these elements from the past that are collected, looted, exchanged, and inherited by making them part of our lives today. If we try to project ourselves into the past conditions of the objects, we run the risk of reintroducing this ethnographic present, which is this kind of system whereby people from other parts of the world are fixed, they're kind of held in a time frame that doesn't change. And it's an old trope of anthropology. And if we do that, we introduce hierarchies, divisions, and other questionable forms of identification and taxonomy. And Benjamin contrasts the collector with the allegorist, okay? And I think that's a very interesting idea, to look at the archival act as an allegorical act. He says the allegorist is, as it were, the polar opposite of the collector. They have given up the attempt to elucidate things through research into their properties and relations. They dislodge things from their context, and from the outset, it relies on their profundity to illuminate their meaning. The collector, by contrast, brings together what belongs together. By keeping in mind their affinities and their succession in time, they can eventually furnish information about the objects. I want to give you a case study of fracturing the archive. So when we did, Marjolein will remember if she read Skin in the Game, there was a moment when we were talking about, we set up this group, the Metabolic Museum University, with the faculty in Berlin, and it was during COVID, and we wanted to institutionalize ourselves in some form or other. And one of the classic examples to create a new institution is to have artists donate works, right? So if you think of Cooper Union, you think of the Städel Museum, you think of all these museums, not only did they have kind of buildings and structures and politics and what have you, and finance, but they also had the donation of works by artists. Now, at one point we held a debating chamber on ominous objects, and Bless offered their fur wig, number 00. And this fur wig is, if you like, the iconic Bless work, these designers, Bless. It's the work that got them famous. So at the end of the debate, I said to them, would you potentially allow us to, would you give the Metabolic Museum University your fur wig? And I knew that if they said yes, they would be disrupting their own biographical structure. There would be really important piece would be missing. And I began to think about it more and more and more. Why would this not be possible? Why would it not create, if you like, a flourishing in another area of their own presence? And what happens if you have a hole like a tooth missing in your mouth when you're trying to create your own archive? What does it do? And this kind of circulation of material into other areas is, I think, a really important way of breaking down the authority of contextual thinking. And here, again, a similar situation, of collective working with the archive. So when we had this very important debating chamber, they actually cut those who had hair. They cut a piece of hair off each of us, and they made a hairbrush during the time of the debate, which was 3 hours. Let's talk about another thing, okay? Let's talk about open storage. Now, open storage is, for me, very close to collection vanitas. It's archival necrophilia, and there's so much necrophilia at the moment. How many exhibitions have you seen that are made in important locations with dead artists? And nothing against dead artists, right? But there's a kind of a laissez-faire attitude on the part of curators that if the artist is dead, well, hey, let's go to town. Let's paint the walls pink. Let's get in a lot of material. Let me hobnob with somebody from a blue-chip gallery to get the right piece in. It's a big kind of, it requires a lot of interesting and expensive scenography. So, and of course, the artist cannot speak back. That's one type of archival necrophilia, the curatorial necrophilia. The other one is open storage, and I'm very, very doubtful about it. So recently I went to the Victoria and Albert storehouse in East London, and I was, again, it confirmed to me that this is a dupe. It's a fake, right? You walk in, some of you will have seen it, and you think that you're looking at a lot, but actually you're looking at a lot of stuff that you wouldn't really want to even look at normally. It's a sort of like a giant IKEA warehouse from the 19th century with bad furniture and lots of boxes, which you can see here, that are showing maybe a poster or something. And there's clearly a wow effect to be had at the storehouse. It's a kaleidoscope of unveiled artworks. But, you know, it's still a colonial matrix. You still have the gallery system, the architecture of the museum like a department store. You have this effect of walking through. Nowhere in the midst of all these objects do you find tables and chairs. There's no attempt to create a civic space. Yes, if you have a lot of time, you can order 5 objects and then you get taken into a smallish room and they show it to you, but your eye is not able at the same time to poach from other places, to look at things in conjunction with one another. So it's again this kind of return to a slightly spurious notion of this is a very special piece which you're going to look at in this special room. And the website describes the place as bigger than 30 basketball courts, a sporting analogy that somehow misses the point. It's very interesting if you think about it in terms of the current bankruptcy of big department stores. This is like a big department store. I could go into detail, but I'm not going to right now. But it is no different. And yet, all over Europe, these department stores are going bankrupt because people are buying online. So you would have thought that if they're not going to put benches down in places where people can actually work, remember that you don't need an exam to go into a place like this. So it's a bombshell of material for self-education. Well, what happens is that instead, they ask you for every single object to scan a QR code. So what happens is that the viewer, the punter, having looked like this, then looks into their telephone on a screen the size of a biscuit and then doesn't need the storehouse anymore, right? So there's a total failure in terms of this kind of problem of how do you beat the micro-encyclopedia of the telephone. And of course, I'm not going to go into detail here, but you have one yourself. It's a much more high class. It's got a good restaurant at the top. It's expensive, where the joke with the V&A storehouse is that it's free. You don't pay to get in. So can you imagine the lost opportunity? Makes me cry to think of it. Whereas here, yeah, you pay 20 euros, you don a white coat, and then you walk through, right? And you think you're in a reserve collection. It's not true. Okay, the last kind of question mark that I want to raise is the question of curatorial hygienics. And this relates to the structuring of exhibitions, their renewal, the timing of exhibition making, the cleansing, the programming, and the perceptual distancing away from the artwork. And it begins with the activation of a neutered space, right? You don't do a show where there's a trace of another artist in the room. Yeah, it's considered bad practice. You clean it away. You paint the walls. You spend money. Yeah, when I did a show at KW called Skin in the Game, I refused to allow the institution to put 25,000 into repainting the walls. So I sat there on the 3rd floor and I thought, hey, you know what? I'm going to work with the notion of neighborly dislike. Neighborly dislike. So I'm going to go back to this situation today where people are in forced migration. There's wars, there's conflicts, there's ecological disasters. You have to move. Do you think that everybody can then go and buy a pot of paint and happily repaint the walls of wherever they've landed? No, it's not possible. So there's a complex emotional mix of empathy and repulsion that is deep-seated, and the exhibition hygienism is to efface all of that. And so that's what I did. I took over the remnants of Karen Lamasson's exhibition, and it was a hugely liberatory moment. And here you can see Joël Turlinx and Ottobong Nkanga working on this show. And, you know, yeah, I'm going to speed up a little bit. And I think then perhaps the last 2 slides that I'm going to show you now if I hope will kind of make sense, having spoken about the promise. And then what was that great comment? Something, I've forgotten it now. I've forgotten my own, not my writing, but somebody else's. Doesn't matter. But the allegorist, remember, that this kind of the potential of doing something with exhibitions, but also on the basis of archives, very often secondary collections, I mean, they're the ones that interest me at the moment, is to try and create a situation of visual parataxis. Now, I'm sorry if I keep dropping these big words, but we are dealing in many ways with tropes. Yeah? And sadly, we don't study rhetoric anymore, but rhetoric is not big statements. It's not managerial speak. Rhetoric is a complex way of structuring meaning. You have irony, you have metaphor, you have parataxis, you have metalepsis, and these are interesting because they allow you to think in a syntax that is maybe not the one that we're used to. And visual parataxis comes from linguistics, obviously. Parataxis means that you have sentences that are not hierarchical. You have phrases. You don't have this classic subject, object, pronoun, adjective, full stop, right? You have a different kind of punctuation. And for me, this idea of visual parataxis allows for a bleeding assemblage of agent objects, a hemorrhaging of meanings beyond the framework of a given context. Remember that the problem with disciplinary authority is that it reverts back to context. It'll say, yes, but you don't have the context to this work. You don't know what it's really about, and I know what it's about because I come from art history, or I come from military history, or I come from anthropology. And that construction of context is deeply fundamental to the ongoing existence of disciplines as we know them. And it's a trap word, right? It's a really dangerous word. It's easy to use. So visual parataxis refers to the juxtaposition of images, objects, or artworks side by side without a clear hierarchy or narrative order. It opens the doors of perception, if you like, so that the eye can go on its travels in an unregulated way. It's a vagabonding endeavor. It's poaching, again, across fields and mixing references once fenced off into discrete sectors. And so now I'll show you my last slide. I don't want to go into great detail about what I'm working on now, but I'm showing you my research diagram. It's how I work. I always stick things on a piece of paper. And at the moment, I'm preparing an exhibition called the Département des Pièges. It's a clear reference to Brother's Département des Aigles, and it will open at KANAL in 1 year. I'm only a curator at large. I'm not a chief curator or anything as wonderful as that, but I have had the possibility to go into the reserve collections of museums in Brussels, all kinds of museums, private ones on sex, large, big ones on military history, and I have gone around asking them if they have traps. And I have never come across a more useful hook. I trap them. I trap the custodians by asking them if they have traps. And they go, huh? Traps? And I say, yes. How do you imagine a trap? And they will say, well, a trap is semantic and juridical. And then I think, hey, got you, I caught you. Or they will speak about lure, or trompe-l'œil, or a fake, or a pun. Or we can pull out blue balls that are used to teach people how to construct a bomb, Or we can go to a natural history reserve and find a chimera, a fake animal that has been constructed by humans to dupe nature. These are all traps, right? And so what happens is that we get an action of collective problem formation, a secessionist marking up of things that would normally never be seen, and the trope, and the last jargon that I'm going to give you, of metalepsis. Now, the late and great anthropologist Paul Rabinow, who was a close friend of mine and who I learned a lot from, who worked in the early days in Berkeley with Michel Foucault, he wrote about metalepsis, and I'm going to just give you a line on what he said. He said, metalepsis, watch it, takes up the past or an aspect of the past, or rather the enduring presence of something past, and makes it function within a different narratological milieu, thereby subordinating it to a different function and thus transforming it and making it present. So visual parataxis engineers a situation that is favorable to metalepsis. To conclude, everything I've spoken about today is nothing more than a series of exercises. We need to exercise how we work much more. And a metalepsis is going on. And you know why we need to do it? Because we have to reach, in Foucault's word, we have to reach the edge of the forest of words. We have to look at more non-hierarchical methods to restore equilibrium in relation to the weight and inclination of colonial taxonomies. And to remember that effacement, omission, effacement, even those small boxes that I mentioned, the effacement of the worker, the annihilation of the presence of somebody's contribution to an institution, is a blurring over the individual's right of expression, even in the archive and with relation to collections. Surely, to open up collections is an absolute necessity, even if one runs the danger of falling oneself into traps. The trap of reproducing the imperialist new, the promise, the new. Remember, we don't like the new. It's a bit liberal, is probably unavoidable. And that could be the promise we spoke about only earlier. But is this promise of the new only an imperialist concept? And are we not happy within allegory rather than staying within the constraints and parameters of the collector? So we have this three questions. We have the question of scale. I think it's really important. Are we talking about small boxes? Are we talking about huge collections? Or are we talking about subjective archives? What makes an archive different from a collection? What is this question of scale? Even if I say to you I'm working on traps, that's a new archive, how big or small is that? The second thing is the importance of non-regulated research. No academic, artistic research, PhD, blah, blah, blah. Non-regulated. In other words, poaching, queering, and trying out exercises in tropes, in rhetoric, in visual parataxis. And we will always face, even more today perhaps than 20 years ago, the problem area of archival and collection vanitas. The fake hopes of open storage, that's going to let everybody see what we really have, where in fact all it does is allow the museum to gloat at its own glory. And finally, the politics of conservation, both in terms of the conservation of the notion of academic context and in terms of the breakdown of materiality. So, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, sorry, thank you for the wonderful talk. Just a very practical question. What was point 3? I couldn't listen anymore because of the...
Well, scale, non-regulated research, and the problem areas, which are these things that are curatorial hygienics, collection vanitas, the open storage coming back and pretending that it's got the solution to the collections, the burden of collections, and of course the ideology of conservation. It's utterly ideological. 1,000 years is what I was told. That's how long something has to last in a collection.
Yeah, maybe I have a question to you, referring back to your talk. Very inspiring, I think. With regards to the furniture or the seatings in the archive, I've been in the archive here twice, and I think it's absolutely fantastic to see the old footage, to go through the little tapes, all these different things. There are a few chairs, but it's somehow I feel that I miss the issue of study, no? Because it's somehow very limited to 1 or 2 seats next to the audio deck or the cassette deck or something. And I'm thinking like, okay, how can students, which we are all, I would say, how can they study in length? I also think, but that's an extra remark, that it shouldn't end the end of the month, but it should be up for another year to get us all used to the idea that it's there actually and that we can do this. But that's
Well, the first thing is if anybody noticed, the furniture is all from old exhibitions, so the furniture is also part of the display. But we try to make little workstations. I know it's not many, but that was also, we didn't want to clutter the rooms. So it was a conscious choice to have like 4 real workstations where people can watch audio and video on their own accord, and to have some easy chairs. So there's an easy chair with the publications and an easy chair with the index of our own archive.
Can I also...
Yeah. So that's part of it.
This is really incredibly important, because something as banal as furniture can change the whole civic position of a museum radically. I hunt for furniture in museums. I kind of check out the colonial matrix of a structure. Then I look how the body is looked after. And so for that, I look where the furniture is. And if you take the storehouse, it's such a failed opportunity, because there's a big space, the collection hall, where if they had put 4 or 5 long tables, right, people would sit down, and even if they do nothing, their eye is wandering, they're looking. And the show that I'm doing for KANAL is going to be, it's very hard to do it, but there will be a large table, and on that table will be traps, all sorts of traps, and part of those traps will come out of collections, secondary collections, teaching collections from Brussels, and the others will be artworks, and they'll be numbered, right? So you won't have an explanatory ideology behind it. You will have an attempt to create a space for research, such that, and then around the big table will be another table, so that you don't bump it, right? You have to still take care of things. But what I want is for people to walk into the room and not stand up, but be suddenly interested in sitting down, getting their computer out, and usurping the heat and the light of this venue, right? And I don't know why furniture is neglected, why it's put nearly always you will find a bench facing a blank wall, as I did with the storehouse. And the more you start hunting for the furniture, you understand that it's ideological, because nobody wants any visitor to spend too much time, right? So if, the old saying goes, if you stand too long in front of a Gerhard Richter, you're subversive, there's a problem, right? So you can't exactly sit on the floor and pull out your laptop, but if you have tables and chairs, the commercial, consumerist format of museums today gets shuffled, gets broken, and we're in the most consumerist moment possible. We're back in 1860. We're no different from the 1860s today, where the development of museums with their galleries and department stores like Le Bon Marché, or all of these great department stores, were built at exactly the same time. And the key to it is that you don't sit down, because a walking consumer is a consumer. A sitting consumer, unless they're in a champagne bar, they're a problem. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah.
Comment on Lisbeth's question. Gabi is already for a year trying to organize here the organ, which is a place where you can study. There's chairs, there's tables, there's books. There's a part of the archive also in the organ. And we, at least Gabi, does a huge effort to make this study place possible. But also people have to get used that you do that.
But we often think that artists don't want that. We still have this kind of like 20 meters, Jackson Pollock kind of, we need distance to look at an artwork. And I always thought that it's mad, because I'm sure if you asked artists, do you mind if there's a huge table in the room where you're showing your paintings? Lubaina Himid has done it. She did it in the States. She put a big table, and then she had paintings of people in conversation around that big table. And so what happened was that people were sitting in conversation with one another, looking at paintings of people in dialogue with one another too. And you could book the table and you could hold your collective meetings there. But, you know, why not take an artist as kind of straight and clean as Wade Guyton, do a show with him, and then put huge tables in the room? If you ask artists, they probably wouldn't have a problem with it at all. Yeah? It's a question of ergonomy. The problem of the human body in this cultural consumerism.
Hello, thank you so much for the talk. My name is Bubby. I'm really interested in this idea of this kind of rhetorical reading of archives and museums. Could you maybe kind of expand on that a little bit, and in combination with this kind of spatial embodiment of an archive as well? So how do you reconcile the narrative with like space?
Well, if I love this. The way you phrased it already changes it in my head, but I like the idea that I could go down into a collection now, into a reserve, and instead of looking at the classification that I've been offered, the guns are over here, the bombs are over there, that I would look at it from, if I was properly trained in rhetoric and that I would look at it and try and relate it to the syntax of a statement. Yeah, so I would say, the guns are, what are the guns, and what is that? What kind of rhetorical structure that does it refer to? Maybe that's something to be done. I would love to do that. It's very sad that rhetoric is no longer really taught. The French pulled it outside of their curriculum in the 19th century, and we don't really know much about, we know about metaphor, and simile, the kind of basic stuffs, and irony, of course, but things that are more complex like parataxis or metalepsis or others. So with parataxis, the point for me is that the things will be on the table, and there will be numbers, and you can look up what this particular object is, and it'll be written then by the conservators of the museum. So it's not me who's writing I will allow for that contextual moment to be in a catalogue, but I don't want it right close up to the object. In other words, I have to develop visual thinking. And I think we need to try and encourage that, because there's a disempowerment of the visitor who will, a very simple thing. Why are the texts on exhibitions put at the beginning and not at the end? Why do we have to read so much before we move on through a show? And I find that very, very standardizing and very problematic. So I'm testing out this question of how to place things next to one another so that they create adjacencies, they allow for new ideas to emerge. And of course, the problem that I'm now facing, because we're reaching the point where we're asking for the loans from all these museums, is that they don't want their objects on the table to move. Right? But I want them to move, because if I don't move them round, I'm blocking all kinds of semantic flow and imaginative flow. So that's the only answer I can give you. It's a case of testing things out. Yeah. Thank you, Bobby.
Restituer, de récupérer des œuvres d'art chez nous, au Congo. Et déjà, nous sommes contents de participer à ces échanges. Les archives sont inaccessibles pour les artistes déjà ici. Et pour les communautés sources, en Afrique, c'est encore double. On est vraiment éloigné même si elles étaient disponibles aujourd'hui, on ne saura pas venir pour accéder. Donc, ce genre d'échange, si dans le futur, on peut aussi pouvoir partager aussi avec nos communautés en Afrique, pour qu'on puisse déjà savoir ce qu'on a perdu, pour que sur le chemin de la récupération, on peut cibler, et à travers la connaissance et les archives, on peut savoir ce qu'on a perdu pour pouvoir aller à la récupération. Merci.
I will try and translate it briefly, unless everybody understands French. No. I think Cédar, who is part of the CATPC in Lusanga, in RDC, he is saying that accessibility to the archives of the objects that have been removed from Congo, and that the fact that the archives are inaccessible, be they in the States or in Belgium or in other countries or here, makes it very difficult. Am I right, Cédar? Yeah? Can you, maybe Renzo, if you want to add on that? Did I translate that right? Yes, but you know, what I would say, Cédar, I say it in French, and then I can repeat myself in English, that's okay. Moi, j'ai beaucoup de problèmes avec la réification d'archives qui sont les archives qui ont été créées par des ethnologues ou des historiens de l'art. Je sais qu'aujourd'hui, on a besoin d'avoir un recours à ces archives, parce qu'il n'y a pas d'autres textes, si on veut, ou de traces. Hein. Mais c'est tellement important aujourd'hui, comme l'a dit Benjamin, de poser ces questions dans le contemporain et d'avoir un certain pouvoir de créer les archives d'aujourd'hui avec les objets, même si ce sont des objets qui ont subi des violences épistémologiques très graves. So I just meant my response is to say that even though we are reliant on the material that was gathered by art historians or anthropologists to contextualize the objects that have been removed, stolen, whatever you want to call it, I think it's incredibly important not to reify these collections, and following Benjamin, to have the freedom and the emancipation of them to begin to bring them into the present and start building new archival knowledge. So I understand the importance of getting access to these things, but having run a museum of anthropology for 5 years, I can tell you it's all phantasmagorical. And actually, provenance research today is the resuscitation of a problematic form of knowledge production in anthropology. It's not something that is not. It's a sham. Right? They didn't write anything down at the time. They wrote it when they were back in the States or in Europe. So if their archives are empty and they're now looking for provenance, all you're doing is building a renaissance of anthropological discourse. And I'm not party of that. I don't believe in it. And especially in Germany, where you have this historicist model of ethnography.
These speakers, they were all invited because they're in somehow related to small archives. Again, their bios are all on our website, so I'm not going to bore you with that stuff. So we'll start with archival consciousness. It's Mariana, Lanari, and Remco van Bladel who will do their talk. And we invited archival consciousness because they played an important role in the first publication of part of our archive online. One of our wishes of our archive is to make it more accessible to anybody who is interested in exhibitions we made or events we did. And the easiest way is online. Because just to give you an indication, we get about a request a week for information about a show we did in the past. But it's much more easy if people can browse themselves and maybe discover something they were not asking. And Archival Consciousness has the website Bibliograph, where they allow small institutes to cooperate and put part of their archive online. And we already started it long before we started with the exhibition for 35 years, and it was part of Innovation Lab subsidy, which helped explore how we can make things more accessible and put online. And in the show, there's also a scan table, because we wanted to invite the public to participate in the experience of archiving and digitizing. And that's their scan table. It's not ours, we rented it. And the fun thing is that when people scan a publication of ours, it immediately is shown up online. And it also helps us to think like, what does it mean to involve the public, and what are the results of that? And how can we expand that part of our archive? But I'm not going to tell everything, because we invited them. So, applause for Mariana and Remco.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marilyn, for the introduction and for organizing this symposia, and Gabi as well to open Melly for this exhibition about the archive, which is a 6 months exhibition, so we are also happy that at least is a longer time than usual. So we started Archive of Consciousness inspired by the Marxist concept of class consciousness. So it's not meant as personal consciousness. And social consciousness sparks by the perception of a set of opposing or contradicting social tendencies, and it evolves in the process of that contradictions being articulated. So we also don't speak about archives in general, but always specifically. And in this sense, small archives are really important because they are always very specific. And we think that every archive has a story to tell. And so my interest in studying in the archive, so not studying exactly the archive, is also because of this aspect of the web and technology and how it changed the way we read, the way we study, and the way we write, and as a consequence, the way we think and the way we relate to each other. And so, and the archives, so smaller archives also started to suffer the consequences of digitization when the physical archives started to, somehow when I started doing this 10 years ago, losing importance within the institutions. And so because of the digital, everything because of the digital. At the same time, the smaller archives, they witnessed the whole changes of mediums in the last 30 years. So they also archive all of these changes. And that's what makes it also very special. And small institutions, although they have, in a way, let's say, small archives, if you compare with national archives or the KB, they also... sorry, what am I meant to say? I forgot. So they were also not affected by the internet and by digitization because they are non-commercial. So they were also preserved in terms of their medium and their processes. And the most important thing in small archives, in fact, are archivists and the methods of archiving. So I'm going to show our method of archiving the archive, and also of our attempt to develop methods to read the archive, and in a way to read digitally and with the archive through the archive of the Appel. And we developed this system actually after 2 exhibitions that were only like performance-based, and then at the Appel we started actually developing a system together with the archive and together with Nell at Appel, and here with Marilyn, and always with the archivists. This is Vismos, and when she started the Appel in 1975, she had also worked at the Stedelijk Museum Library, and she immediately started a documentation center. So it's really remarkable that a sort of a performance institute where it doesn't generate that much material, or how do you archive performance, it starts already with the documentation center. And this is the former shape of the archive of the Appel. So when I started to collaborate with Nell, and Nell had a project at the time of it's called Spaces Run Archive, and she wanted to put the entire archive on a container and tour the world, sort of make the archive somehow autonomous. And she invited me to help her by setting up radio frequency technology on the objects of the archive, so that the books didn't need to be stored in a right place. And it was really interesting that by trying to free the books from the shelves, we made the entire, also the data of the archive mobile. And behind this project of Nell, it also somehow a cry for the precarity of the archive, and a way to try to sort of secure this archive and the story of this archive during this like precarity phase, which is a very long phase already since I started 10 years. Perhaps now it's getting better, but it's every move or every year it has been a doubt, will the archive continue, can the archive continue, the idea that the archive is unsustainable. And so that I think that that's my interpretation, that the idea of packing the archive already had to do with this. So we made a simulation of transporting the archive from the archive space to the exhibition at the Appel, to the aula in the former space of the Appel. And if you can move the archive for 100 meters, you can also move it across the ocean. The procedure is going to be a bit similar. And here is the entire archive of the Appel in the exhibition space. And so also everything you saw in that room contracted in the shelves in 100 square meters. It's all there, and there's a lot of books. But if you look before the stage, there's also folders with all the people's archive, and under the benches there are all the pictures and invitations and press material. And even the seats of the archivists is also in the stage. And so the exhibition also reflects this precarity with all the objects on the floor, but they are protected with a notebook specially made for that. And also we made these beautiful piles, which also inspired people to be very careful around the books. And also the Appel has extremely valuable books, and these vitrines were organized by Jacqueline. They're also here, and they were on the stage. And this is also the beauty of this archive, that all this material is actually available, or was available at the time, like just by for every visitor to handle it. And so we created on the floor a drawing of the sort of a data model. So we were also, as you're going to see a bit later, starting to digitize books together with the audience. And the exhibition space had a framework for the circulation of people, using as a drawing the data model that we created for the archive, already based on the database of the Appel. And this is also based on what we hear about or know about linked data. And this is a drawing of this ontological model. And you see that the books, they don't fit in the database really well. It doesn't fit in the model. It requires really a translation, sort of a mediation. So they change, and the whole model is based on this vertical axis. On top is a collection, and then there's an object. So book, we centered the book, but it could be a tape, could be any type of object. And around this object, you see the metadata, and the page of a book is also an object. And these colors, so we use purple for object, and green for people, and gray for space, and yellow for text. So across all our system, you're going to see this color, so that's what I'm telling it. And in the lower part of this vertical axis, which is not a hierarchy, it's more of a superposition, is the part of the text, the content. So we use the ontology or a taxonomy for the sake of circulation of objects, not to categorize text. So this is a perception that I had really by performing this idea of finding links between books in the archive. And this system is an ontology. Somehow this is the language behind the web, if you want. And the ontology itself is a complex system, but it is all made of linked data, which is, so this is, let's say, the basic element of that drawing, and it corresponds to a simple sentence of a subject, predicate, and object. So we invited the public to create linked data manually and to digitize books as a way also of digital and data literacy, which starts by our own data literacy, which you think like is kind of a necessity to navigate in this world.
So in one of the things, and Marjolein already explained a little bit, is one of these tables is our mobile archive unit, and that's a table that we developed to digitize. Actually, it's kind of a way into the system. It's a bridge between the physical and the digital. So this is, you could see it almost as a copy stand or a kind of a Xerox machine in which you normally in a library could take a copy of your book back home, but instead, when you make an image of any type of object, you publish it directly into the archive. And so it's kind of a crowdsourced way of looking through the eyes of the visitors, the staff, to kind of see what is being digitized. The only little piece of AI that we actually use here is that we kind of clip the image from the background, but it also contains the traces of the people that are watching. So often you will witness and see that the hands of the visitors will appear in the image itself as well. And so the table is actually a little tabletop with 2 lights and a phone app that actually binds this directly. So in the case of the Appel, where you saw all these people kind of running around in the archive, we individually tagged and placed RFID stickers in every 16,000 books of the Appel. And then when you place the book on top of the table, there's a reader underneath, and it automatically detects which object is on it. You can scan an image to it, and it binds it directly to the archive and to the record of the database. So throughout the entire period of the catching up in the archive, the show at the Appel, we kind of digitized kind of over 10,000 of images, which is nearly, of course, it's just a fragment. We're not doing this to kind of be complete, because it would be insane almost to think in completing this task at the Appel. But it's kind of a slow endeavor. It also takes the speed of the archive. It's a kind of a slow process to just kind of continuously kind of look through the archive and see what people kind of pick out and gaze, or maybe hunt as to... So if you publish that, so you directly kind of, these images are shown on Bibliograph, and that is the system that we created. So for every collection, there's kind of a set of applications that enable you to publish your archive. And in the case of the Appel, you can find amazing materials there. We already saw a little bit in the show, but there are some really cool old catalogs. And also from me as a graphic designer perspective, I love to hang out with Nell and Jacqueline and find all kinds of cool stuff that I can just touch, and it's not behind glass or anything. So there's a general timeline, and here's a chronological event where you see all the materials kind of being captured through the table. So these are the traces of all these events that are happening on the table. And when you kind of like open up the metadata of some of these images, then you see what everything that has been captured in there. And the last view, you can also see the entire overview of all the data of the Appel. So this is the overview of 16,000 objects in the archive.
Yeah, and also about this view is also this idea of trying to see a totality of the archive. So where is the borders? What is around it? Because an archive, a database or an archive or the web or a search is always finite, as big as it might be, there's always contained somehow. And this is, you can see, it looks a bit unreadable, but that's in a way what we are trying to also research into. What are the ways of reading into the archive? So for example, here you see the Metropolis M. So the Appel has also, and every archive is like this, is smaller collection. So a collection is made of smaller collections. So this is the entire collection of Metropolis within the larger collection of the Appel. And the books published by the Appel, and there's also a lot of books published by Melly, are also within this, this graph relating to each other. So after the exhibition, we received invitation of Frame, and they also wanted to have their archive articulated. And we saw that archives, physical archives, were in a precarious situation and fragile, and Frame didn't actually have a physical archive. Their whole history was archived within a website for 15 years. So we realized that the digital-born collections are in an even more fragile situation, because it is easier to lose a website, basically if you don't pay for 2-3 months, is really gone, than it is to get rid of a physical collection, which also happens, but the websites are even more fragile. So I learned basically based on this commission how to get from the database in the back of the website only what is the content. The texts that were actually really added. And this is really a small part also of the database, because it's mostly noise inside. But even Frame, that is a young organization that has 15 years old, has 6,000 pages archived in there. Yeah. And so here is also a grid view of all the images that were already in the archive. And then so the system that we started at the Appel is shared at Frame, and it's also crazy to develop a system, or even develop things digitally for one institute only. So it was already very difficult to make it for the Appel, even saying we want to do this, we want to share this. So it only makes really sense if this is seen as a collective infrastructure. So yeah, so here is the graph of Frame. You see it's a smaller graph, but it's still like a lot of content and a lot of events and a lot of people, so it's also a network. And here is a bit of an overview of how the system works. So in the center, so every collection has their own sort of place, if you want. Like you can see your own collection, but at the same time they inhabit the same system, and there are ways to input data in the system, so the mobile archive unit, and also you can also publish on it. Yeah.
So together with Frame, we also developed this publication tool in which it's possible to actually get the data out. So it's also kind of an exit strategy of ours because we also frankly don't know until when we can afford to keep up this system alive, et cetera, et cetera. So we also wanted to have something that enables you to get the data out in physical books again, because history has taught us that a book can last for hundreds of years, while our hard disks are capable of doing this only for 10 years. So in this case, it's kind of like an editor, so you can publish directly also digital books inside the system and then archive them when they're published inside the system. So this first example was a book that we made together with Framer Framed for the Dutch artist Jonas Staal and Rada de Souza, The Court of Intergenerational Climate Crimes. here's an excerpt. So it's kind of like a way to make physical books from a graph perspective to kind of create this. And another example is this show at Frame of Frame Past Disquiet, where we, by publishing, you not only have a physical copy, but you also have a web book. So it also publishes it directly on the web, and you can kind of browse and scroll through it.
Yeah, in every institute we develop something, we continue sort of the development. And at Melly, we, for the first time also, departed by the images, and so the database at Melly was made by Mariana. So we take from this database and the images of the exhibitions, and yeah, and then for this exhibition we actually included the mobile archive unit also here. So it was also the first archive where we combined exhibition images with the
events.
The events with the library and with the publications of Melly.
Yeah, so where the Appel is actually an overview still of 16,000 objects in the library and the archive of the. Here we combined it with all the data of all the exhibitions since the existence since 1990. So these are just some views of upstairs, if you haven't seen it yet. So the installation with the table and the way to navigate the archive.
Yeah, that's also an experiment because the table is for the public. So in the exhibition at the Appel, we were there, and Jacqueline was there, Nell was there, so the team was always there. And here, like, we let the public digitize without that much supervision. So it's also super interesting how people actually read and also layer books. And here, like, that's also really amazing because we can see this whole collection of exhibition images in fact, this is the first 10 years of exhibition images. Yeah. So you can click on the exhibition, and then you get all the images and the curator and the artist. If you click on an artist, you can see which other exhibitions this artist participated. So it is a way of also sort of reading into like this network, this big network.
Yeah.
And so.
Yeah, I think for the last part, what we wanted to show you is that we've been working with a lot of institutions so far, but we also get a lot of requests by smaller people that have a collection or researchers. So we're kind of expanding the whole system now to kind of create archives from scratch. And the first one that we kind of been working with is a Dutch rave culture archive, in which we bring these tables actually to physical raves, where people can bring their old flyer collections, and actually we kind of digitize them on the fly. So for this, we kind of extended and worked on the phone application to kind of be able to make this metadata basically on the fly and to build this graph from scratch. And then you get collections like these where all kinds of materials kind of come together and form kind of clusters of people that are kind of collections or that have collections within a larger collection. And again, so it's actually continuously expanding the system, and by sharing this and by developing it with our partners, we can kind of continuously kind of expand on the notion of what small collections and small archives could use, but also how we learn from them and how we learn from the archivists.
Yeah, and mainly this, so although this is a system, what matters more is the method. And there's a lot of push towards technology in general, and we want to learn, okay, what is the technology actually doing? And in a way, the archive also sets up a stage where you can verify how technology works. So in the case of Rave, you see that there's only flyers and there's only the name of the collections. So we are developing a prototype using AI to take the data from the flyers directly to the model and see, okay, if this is possible to automate and how it actually works. And so to finish, we just want to show also the archive of Bach in Utrecht, where we started working last year when they almost closed. And again, it's a small, it looks like a small library, but it's a very, very rich institute. It doesn't matter how small it is, an archive is always very valuable and full of stories to tell. Thank you.
The next one, we asked for this symposium, is like the perfect candidate for this symposium. It's Evie Evans of Framer Framed. She was part also of the, as you see, Archival Consciousness project. But I think it's also that Evie has like a job that has like archive as part of it, but also web shop, publication. There's a whole range of things she does. It's a institute that has also not so much a collection as a platform. So it really is an engaging with the public. And I think that's also something that's very difficult sometimes to archive. But she's doing the best she can. We'll give the word to Evie. No. You just have to use the...
Thank you, Marjolein, also for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here, and I'm also very aware of my my position. So I have to give a little bit of a disclaimer because, yes, I'm an archivist by accident. So I can explain a little bit more about the background of Frame because I think it's also important to understand the archive and also the way the organization works. So as Marjolein mentioned, it's more of an art platform, and it was established 15 years ago by the current directors, and it was much more of it was a traveling organization. So they organized a lot of panel conversations, symposia, debates within museums, and were really focused on critical museology, particularly for ethnographic collections within the Netherlands, and also had a big focus on Aboriginal art. So that's kind of the background. And I think that really influences, even today, still how a lot of people in the institution work and also how we think. And that kind of critical thought also extends to archives as well. So I just included this image of the website to kind of show that at the minute we also have this exhibition, Shapeshifters, which is the result of a 4-year research project called Pressing Matter with the World Museum. So this exhibition is also in dialogue with an ethnographic museum and kind of reconsidering what museums could look like, how museums function in terms of knowledge production and representation, and inviting contemporary artists to reflect on this idea of how can we rethink these institutions from more of a perspective of care. So, yes. So I want to explain a little bit. I think Mariana and Remco also did a lot of hard work for me, so they already mentioned. But I also included the website because Framer Framed is a digital-born organization, and as I mentioned, was established with these smaller programs before finally gaining a space. And it's also in Dutch, what is called a presentatieinstellingen. So we don't have our own collection. We organize programs, exhibitions like this, events, and I think that also completely changes the way we archive and the way we think about archives as well. I wanted to mention as well that we have this previous exhibition that Remco also showed the handout, Past is Quiet. So along with museology and being an art space outside of the museum and looking more critically at these institutions, we also had this exhibition this year, Past is Quiet, with Rasha Salty and Christine Curry on their own archive and documentary collection of solidarity movements across the world in the 70s and 80s. And a really big part of this exhibition was internal research together with the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam to include a section specifically about solidarity movements, resistance protests within the Netherlands and Amsterdam in particular, connecting to all these different struggles. So there's also the mention of Palestine, Chile, Nicaragua, and anti-apartheid movements in South Africa as well. Remco also mentioned the CICC book, the Court for Intergenerational Climate Crimes. This is a larger exhibition. I somehow included a lot of exhibitions that don't really have specific artworks that you can include in an archive or a collection, but it also kind of exemplifies, again, the way we work. And I was really thinking, my brain was kind of racing during Clémentine's talk, because this idea that you have to make a space clean and you don't have any previous traces of an exhibition. I think this is a perfect example that this huge installation required so much wood that in an attempt to be sustainable, we are still reusing it in exhibitions today. And someone asked, is this the frame-of-frame style or this wood? And it's just us trying to use it all up. I think I will jump ahead a little bit. So yeah, as I mentioned, we're a digital-born organization. So the only physical things to archive, which we do in a very informal way, it's just a personal collection within the office, are publications. So this is just a compilation of publications. A lot of them are new, but also the CICC one is the one using Publish, the hybrid publication tool. So it's also part of this hybrid archive, as well as exhibition posters, flyers. Those are the only kind of things that tangible that we have. And I started again with the website because everything that is in the archive is the website, basically. So that's what Mariana was mentioning, that they were looking at the archival consciousness looked at the content from the website. So everything that Frame of Frame has ever done that's in the archive is online for people to see, but it's harder to navigate if you don't know what you're looking for, which is why Bibliograph was so important as a new way to visualize the archive and be able to access it as a means of research, or also for other artists, and also for a larger cultural ecosystem within the Netherlands, which is why it's also really wonderful to be part of this network that is using Bibliograph and Publish with other organizations, so that you can really compare how organizations work and whether there are connections between them. It's really amazingly visualized as well. So back to me. As I mentioned, I'm, I would say, an archivist by accident, because I actually began working at Frame of Framed in 2020, which is, very interesting timing. And I started as an intern. And I was there for about a month working on exhibition production before the very first lockdown. So immediately it was, okay, a lot of gung-ho, what can we still do? Everything we had was on the website, and my first task was to go through all the biographies we had on the website, update them, check what artists are doing now, see if there's anything interesting, making sure all the information was correct, and also translating any that were only in Dutch or only in English, making sure that the website maintained its bilingual nature. So in 2020, there were almost 400 entries of different people. And I checked last month, and now we have 1,300 entries just of people. So this is an example of what the website looks like. So this is a screenshot from an exhibition performing colonial toxicity by Samia Henny in collaboration with If I Can't Dance. And it's also an archival exhibition. She really powerful show that was showcasing archives from the French nuclear program in Algeria and the Algerian Sahara, and a lot of the archives are still, that top secret, not supposed to be shared. So it's a very powerful act to put them in an exhibition space and present them in this specific way. But so you can see that whenever there's an exhibition page, there's always connected, a network connected. So you have Samia and you have Megan, the curator. And so I started with these biographies. And just by doing that, going through all of them, reading about people, I somehow became the one person in the organization that knew the most about previous events, previous programs and exhibitions. And then suddenly I was the person people were asking, oh, you know, is there anyone we could invite again for this? Or can we connect something else? Or even in each exhibition, the introduction in the catalog always has a mention of kind of thematic threads that run through the work of Frame of Framed. And so I also began researching. So for example, I think if I jump back, this is an exhibition Charging Myths with the collective On Trade Off. A lot of artists are from Brussels, but also the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And so I co-wrote the introduction for the exhibition, really tracing the various events or the various programs we had related to mining and extractivist culture, because the On Trade-Off Research Collective did a lot of did work on Monono mines in the Congo, tracing that history that stems originally from the colonial occupation of the Congo and how it still affects people today. So it was really interesting to also see that one of the first Frame of Framed exhibitions was about mining culture in Limburg and throughout the Netherlands. And so there's always these connections to be found. So this is also an image of the Frame of Framed bibliograph, the archive that you can access online. And I included this, even though you've already seen a little bit of it, just to show you the key. So as I mentioned, we don't have a collection. One of the main parts of my job as an archivist, which, there isn't a lot to do in that respect, but I always make an overview of every single exhibition, which artworks are there, even if they don't stay with us. We have a record of what's shown by who, etc., which is especially useful for when exhibitions travel. We have all of the information available. But this shows that what is really key for us is the people. So that's why I wanted to start with the fact that I started with the biographies, because if you don't have any objects in your collection, what are you focusing on? We're focusing on collaborators, the artists, the curators, the other people we work with. And I think you can really see that these are the people that bring things together. They bring the exhibition together. So this is just an example that in 2022, I think, so the people are in green. And as Mariana and Remco already showed, you can click on one person and immediately see everything they've done at Frame of Framed. Also articles, exhibition, programs. And that's really the core of our archive. And I think what I find most significant about that is, if you remove the object and you focus on people, how does that also change how you think about art, how you think about collections, and how you think about objects? I think it's very important to the way we work because of that. So here's a more visual example, again, using the CICC. You can see Jonas is connected a lot with RADA because they did this project together, and then they have all the different events, also different magazine posts, because they also publish texts on the website as well. And it really just, I think, brings everything together, at least for me, that visually you can access this more, because as I said, the website is not as easy to navigate, and I think the real goal for the archive is to make it much more accessible for people, more transparent also about the way we work. And so thinking of the topic of today, of the symposium, and what is the wish for the archive, I think that's the main goal, is that people will be able to use something like Bibliograph to be able to, students especially, to write essays about exhibitions, or even find artists that they want to work with, or find artworks that they want to see. So that's kind of the next step, because at the moment it's focused more on the people and the events. And then hopefully we can also include the artworks as well, so that you can see what's in each exhibition, and have a clearer also understanding of what happens to an exhibition once it's over. I think another wish that I also have for the archive is to really highlight the commissions that we do. Usually each exhibition, Frame of Frame, will commission 1 or 2 artworks, and I think that's also really important for people to be able to track these the journeys of objects. I think it's a big topic now also with repatriation and restitution. But for example, with contemporary art, you can see, okay, it was produced or commissioned by one institution and then bought by another, and it really creates this, again, this bigger ecosystem of contemporary art within the Netherlands. So that's also a future goal, hopefully. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Isabel Sully. She is Rotterdam-based at Tail of a Tap. And what struck me when I was preparing this symposium is that I couldn't find an archive or an archivist on their website. And I was intrigued by that, because I think, being Rotterdam-based myself, I've seen a lot of interesting shows and events at Tail of the Tap. I always say de instead of a, sorry. I think that's really something to preserve, because I think a lot of people in Rotterdam, but also visitors from abroad or other places, they see in a very small space very interesting things happening. And you want to sometimes go back to these events. So I asked Isabel to give a talk about an institute without an archive.
Hi, thank you. Yes, I'm the odd one out here today. Definitely not an archivist. In fact, trained as an artist, accidentally became a curator through being interested in infrastructural and institutional conditions, and now director of the Tail of a Tub. But I'm going to start with someone else. I'm going to start with Dodie Bellamy. Archivists wine and dine and flatter you until they break through your defences. It's like the archivist's a mummy and you're sitting on the toilet taking your first poo. They say, "Good Dodie," and you give them whatever they want, even tender bits you know are better kept hidden. What archivists want are singular, unique objects, the irreplaceable. All these letters, photos, contracts, yellowed news clippings, flyers, manuscripts. Moving my hands across their object auras, the sadness of materiality strikes me, the inevitability of loss. I think of old people getting ready to die and giving away their stuff. I think of schizophrenics who get rid of everything they own, all their money, and set off. I unearthed the first 2 pages of a letter so intense it verges on love letter. But the final page is missing, and I can't find out who it possibly could have been from. Dismay hits me, this sense of a past vaporized, all that love and anger and realization, my past. The more the papers are organized, I start to think of them as an exoskeleton protecting me from annihilation. The sense of exposure is unbearable. I feel like I'm attending my own wake. I feel like I'm being embalmed, but I bear it because I want the money, because I want to be remembered. Even though the future the archive promises feels impossible. Impossible in that I won't be here any longer. Impossible in that anybody would be interested in my life and stuff. And then there's my apocalyptic pessimism. It's hard to believe that human life won't soon be extinct. Posterity, despite the Benwick Library's climate cold storage facilities, may end up being puny. I gave the archivists everything. Everything except my journals and wedding photos and anything to do with my deceased parents. I kept these tokens out of love and a conviction that I'm not finished yet. While about a personal archive being consumed by an institutional one, I read this quote from Dodie Bellamy now as a kind of reminder of the in and out of timeness of archiving. In the context of A Tale of a Tub, a title such as this one, Not Finished Yet, is twofold. On the one hand, we are a small organisation within which there is little to no established archival practice, in the sense that when it comes to a practice of archiving, nothing but a Google Drive storage and a website backend was handed over to me when I began. On the other, in the spirit of Dodie Bellamy, Not Finished Yet also implies a refusal to throw in the towel, to shut up shop, to accept that all has been done and achieved. It speculates a future. It reflects the condition of an institution that in many senses is in its beginnings. Our archive is not finished yet because it's only just getting started. Off the back of this, over the last 2 years, we have nonetheless begun to establish some archival practices, ones which reflect the in and out of timeness, the in and out of time reality of archives in general. And they do so in quite a literal sense. A Tale of a Tub is located in the former washhouse and bathhouse of the Justus van Effen complex, a heritage monument to social housing located on the outskirts of the city. It is also referred to as a living monument, an oxymoronic designation when thinking from the vantage point of memorialising time. As such, our site is itself a social and architectural archive, and to build our own archive practice, we literally enter this site, doing our archival research while stuck between a very pronounced history and an unfolding present. And through this, we build our program. In practical terms, our archiving practice plays out in 3 ways. Through the site. Here is an image of the building in its current state. So in the centre of the image is the former washhouse and bathhouse at the core of the Justus van Effen complex. And when it was built in 1922 as a kind of experiment in social housing for the city's dock workers, the bathhouse had this social function. It was where everyone met, it was where everyone bathed, and there was no private facilities for this. So this former history of the building of this site of sociability and meeting is a core proponent of our program, and from where we begin thinking through working with artists, but also thinking through archiving. This is another image of the site for those who don't know it. Here is also another image of the internal balcony. It's actually called a gallery, which we like to make fun of or not make fun of, but borrow from, since we're ourselves a gallery in the gallery. But it's also an image of the fact that it's still housing. So our immediate audience is a community of people who live directly around us. We're in the center of this image here. It's also a panopticon at times, but it reflects the kind of centrality of the building, both architecturally but also socially. This here is an image of the former use of our space. So it was a wash house where mostly gendered labour took place, where women did the washing. Men actually weren't allowed to enter it. And then in the top floor spaces, there was private bathing and also communal bathing. So there's a history of labour, but also a history of sociability, as I mentioned. This is another image of the upstairs bathing area with private stalls. And here also an image of the milkman who would come around and deliver milk every day, of course, but the significance of this is also how much social function was built into the architecture itself. So from these histories, there are also a lot of moments of political action and community uprising. This here is an image from 1982 when the building was being squatted, and it was in a state of dilapidation. The bathing house wasn't working, and people were demanding attention from the gemeente, or from the municipality. And it is an area that historically is overlooked by the city council as well. Here is another image of a protest that took place when they wanted to stop the tram line to Spangen, to the area where the institution is. So there is a long history of political action and community building through the architecture, through the site. And earlier this year, we did an exhibition with an artist called Brianna Leatherbury, who's an artist based in Amsterdam. And Brianna was very interested in the problems of heating that have faced the complex since its beginning. One of the reasons it's heritage listed is that in 1922, when it was built, it was the first building in the Netherlands to have a centralised heating system, which doesn't sound revolutionary now, but it indeed was at the time. And as modern life changed, this heating system began to fail. It stopped working. It eventually got restored in the early 2000s, but it's again failing now. And so a lot of the residents have unaffordable heating, and we ourselves have absolutely no heating within our institution. And Brianna, being an artist who's very busy with the immaterial yet physical conditions of a space, you could say, really caught on to this history of heating and this contestation of heating within the complex, and decided to build for us a heating system which occupied the ground floor of our space and was made from completely recycled building materials and only from skills learnt from online communities where knowledge was exchanged. So very DIY, very affordable, very much addressing an actual institutional lack at the time. It operated like a kind of space box heater, if people know what that is. So there was a heavily insulated container on our ground floor, which then trapped the heat inside, and it rose up to heat the mezzanine space, where people would then gather throughout the exhibition and survive the colder winter months at a tail of a tub. But this project is an example of how the archive of the site, or the history of the site, is a way in which we build the program, and in turn actually contribute to the archive of the Justus van Effen complex. But in a more, conventionally archival sense, we also deal with building an archive through our graphic identity, with Sabo Day, who's a graphic designer who's been at the institution actually across multiple directorships. So he carries a lot of information in his bones. But the institute, quite a mouthful of a name, is named after this book here by Jonathan Swift called A Tale of a Tub. And it was written in the 1600s and is considered to be the first political satire. And Justus van Effen, who the complex is named after, translated it to Dutch for the first time. So there's this dual literary history at play in the name, but there is also this very practical reference to the fact that it used to be a tub, it used to be a bathhouse. But when I started, we wanted to find a way to bring these kind of archival traces into the graphic identity, and simply, as a starting point, lifted the original title from the frontispiece of the book and put it to work as a logo for the institution, as one kind of nod to this kind of doing archiving within an archive that already exists. We then started publishing a quarterly bulletin as a way to translate what we're doing within the institution beyond art speak, which I think is a debilitating force even for those of us within the field. And through doing these different graphic motifs or different graphic tools, we began to actually include archival notations, I guess, within the material. So in the top left corner here, you can see that it says Bulletin 2 2024. And since the beginnings, we've been, I guess, tagging, you could say, or footnoting all the printed material that we produce. So posters also carry this, advertisements carry this, our digital newsletters, as well as our website. And it's a way to also think about the locality of an archive, that it doesn't need to be contained in one location, but instead it's dispersed and distributed through our audience. And within this kind of simple inventory system, everyone has a way to build their own archive, I guess, as it were, but to just more, I guess, poetically or generally just think about archiving within a dispersed practice. I think I've always also thought, I've always thought about the difference between paperwork and objects in archives, that paperwork has an endless reproducibility. It doesn't operate in the singular. And to think about, what that can be for archives as well, I suppose. And then the third way that we think about building an archive is through the space. So one reality of archives is eternally the question of storage. We have none of this. As Mariana mentioned, we also have no staff to really tend to the question of building an archive. So I made the decision after the first exhibition, which this is an installation shot from that show here, to keep a trace of something from every show in the space going forward. So in this instance, we lent this old telephone from the Howling Telecom Museum, which is a very small, amazing museum in the north of Rotterdam. I would really go if you haven't been before. It's run by a group of 25, 70-plus volunteers on the history of telecommunications from the 1880s until 1990s, they say, but I think they have a few 2000 iPhones as well. But we worked with them to build an exhibition around, I guess, simply put, like feminist inscriptions via telecommunications throughout art history, but also more generally speaking too, because in drawing on the kind of gendered labour of the site of A Tale of a Tub, I also started thinking a lot about other forms of gendered labour, those being administration, but also telecommunications networks being activated predominantly by women. And so we kept this phone, and it's still there today. This is an example of it in Brianna's exhibition. So a way to have the space punctuated by these histories to not be compelled toward this kind of clean slate or tabula rasa approach of exhibition making that Clémentine also touched on. This is an example of how Brianna has been reconfiguring the heating so that they can exist in workable panels that we'll then install every winter going forward, so they'll also be within other exhibitions. We're also in the midst of establishing a broodfonds, which is a Dutch communal welfare model that came from Jay Tan's exhibition last year that was around pension planning. And just recently we started our first Artists in Residence program and wanted to find a way to make this kind of labour that often happens, I guess, not necessarily in the shadows, but at least out of the visibility of exhibition making, to have it registered in the space in some way, so we decided to just include simply these Dutch name labels that you might find next to a doorbell that list the resident, and we'll continue to list them going forward. Lily also got an L on her keys. She's the very first resident, so there's a lot of piloting going on. But we just had an exhibition with Anna Krul, who's a Dutch activist and anagram poet, and we made the decision that each time we have a new resident, we add a new letter to the keys, so there's also this history of the social handling of the keys of the residents, and in turn, a kind of pool of letters from which we can maybe make our own anagrams one day. And Mariana said in her email that we should say a wish. So through these examples and references, what I'm trying to set out is a way of archiving that is led by the social reality of the institution and the social history of the site, as well as a frank assessment of our resources and capacities to actually archive. Informed by feminist scholar Anne Svetkovic, who insists on the value of researching apparently marginal personal collections, describing these as archives of feelings. A goal in our program, and therefore our archiving practice, is to stay true to acknowledgement of our scale, to continually bring to the surface the importance of the web of individuals that come together through varying junctures in time to plot out the narrative arc of this particular tale. We are a small organisation, and even if desired, the impersonal isn't possible. As such, it is an approach grounded in the dirty matter of archival practice, a term used by curator and writer Jo Melvin to describe art's interpersonal connections, passions, opinionated reactions, anecdotes, hearsay, and gossip. Or perhaps another way to put it is that it is an attempt to address administration's lack, to address the limits of what is deemed archival or simply able to be archived at all. When I was asked about this wish, I couldn't stop thinking about a set of keys that were recently returned to me by a colleague finishing up at the institution. This colleague worked above and beyond her role for many years, a true keeper of institutional memory and knowledge. When she handed back her keys, of which I was expecting 2, there were about 20 on the key ring. Multiples of door keys, keys to storages I didn't know existed, or to gates that were single copies and presumed missing. In the context of a wish, these keys act as a kind of metaphor, a prompt to think about institutional responsibility, who is literally carrying it around, and how these material traces are something to be learnt from when building and reading the archive. They are material evidence of responsibility in a moment of pause, before the keys get separated out and redistributed again. A wish is to find ways to better archive these moments of pause, and to work out how we might inscribe them beyond the scope of only who is there in that very moment. The keys also make me think of how much get lost when people leave. And for the sake of posterity, how might we find ways to archive these personal and contextually specific aspects so they are able to be passed on as well? In this spirit and to end, I wanted to share a project that I feel does this, that has been recently developed by our first artist-in-resident, Lily Houston-Hurterik, and which will serve as a big inspiration for us going forward in trying to achieve these wishes. So Lily, in a shared compulsion to archive the unarchivable, started her residency wanting to find ways to attribute credit to work that is done outside of visibility and to illuminate the different networks that make institutional practice. And she decided to build a font that is built up of letters all found on site or belonging to handwriting from people who work at the institution, angry notes left from our upstairs neighbours, references such as the Spangen TV series that was produced in the 90s, artworks from exhibitions where she's pulled the K, handwriting from our colleague Lisanna Janssen, and letters from the tag of our building caretaker, Lucio, as well as numbers also from the architecture itself. This is a reductive version of how extensive the alphabet is, but a way in which to designate and offer credit beyond the sites that it usually is attributed within art. And we've made an agreement together that on completion of the residency, Lily's font will be put to use for labelling not only our storage spaces probably, but also our archives. So it will continue to keep this proposition or this question of how we might maintain committed to archiving a social context at the forefront of our minds as an institution. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. I will never say again that you don't have an archive. I think you've proved me very wrong in this instant. The next and last speaker comes from our sister organization, sort of the Appel. But I think Nell Donkers, who will do the talk, is really our big sister or our hero in the archiving world, especially in the small institute. She will not like that, but that's her problem. You're just a hero for all of us. Because I think she is the first one who really publicly went about archiving. And I'm always very happy when she makes the remote archivist as well. Sometimes in your post box you just get a sort of present and it's the remote archivist. And she does a lot of work to sort of make archiving also more of a thing for everybody in her archival hours, where you talk with other people about archiving. And it's been I think it's interesting to see how somebody works when the institute also moves about. So it's a nomadic institute. Now they have their final, or at least a temporary space again, but you never know how long it will stay there. And the archive of the Appel is also very accessible. When you've been there, you've seen it. So my word is to our hero, Nell.
I wouldn't say small sister, I would say sister. Okay, I will try to keep it short and skip the things that are already mentioned. But this picture I want to show again, because Mariana and Remco already showed it. But this is Wie Smal's, the founder of the Appel. In 1975 it was legally set up with a space. So it's 50 years this year. And what I think is nice about it, that you see the director-founder at the table, which was the first thing what you saw when you came in, and Clémentine was also talking about tables. Because she felt that the people first had to come. You know, in the weekend there had been a performance or something, and there was documentation, and she started the documentation center, which became the archive. But she felt you have to talk about it. So first when you came in, you saw this table, there was tea, and you could sit down and have a talk. And in the small archives, which are, well, part of a small institute, which also has all these problems and also perks, but a lot of problems. Yeah, small institutes. So small archives have small institutes. And small institutes, they all have these things. So in the beginning of 2024, the Appel moved to a temple building in the Pijp in Amsterdam, coming from far west. And also in 2023, new director, Lara Caldi. So things changed. We moved to the temple, and then there was not enough space for the archive and the library, of course. Mariana did a big part in moving this. So a lot of this was going to external storages, which has been there all the time, storages. So we had to make a choice, what are we going to bring and what are we not going to bring. The archives, which is the library, the archive, and the collection unintended, are people can come and visit Wednesday and Thursday afternoons. This I want to show you as what's in the archive, like this correspondence, because it all came about while making events and exhibitions. It's a letter of Laurie Anderson asking to perform. I heard later that she says, I'm doing something in Germany, but that was not true. She made that up just to come in. And this is from that event. Laurie Anderson was invited. There were 3 people in the performance. And this was a leftover. So this is the collection unintended, because I think it was just left over and nobody saw it. It was in boxes for years. And then these were the invitations while Wiesmals was the founder. So there was an invitation, and with the next invitation, they sent the kind of after invitation. So this is what happened. So you have the picture of Laurie Anderson. And I think this was a really nice start of how do you archive and make it publicly, directly, to send it to people, to your public. And at the time, they were already called friends, because they also gave money to the Appel. So small archives, small institutions. There are lots of problems. Here you see the archivist started to make archival presentations. On the left side, you see one that my colleague Jacqueline van Elsberg made. It's about the Appel and heavy times. This happened in 2016 when the Appel had heavy times again. There were a lot of occurrences, no money, no people, no space, always something. So this is a whole vitrine with panic. And this worked really well with my colleagues at the time working in the Appel. Oh, so it's not that bad this time. So it gave a bit of another perspective. This is, I got a gift from the partner of Wiesmals, which were postcards by artists. So there was this network of artists, but not only at the time of the show, but also later on after years, like, hey, nice to, how are you there doing? And from this collection of postcards, we made a presentation. This is René Green made a book in the Appel and a show, and this is a dummy, which was it was on show, people could go through it, and there were a lot of graphic designers that were really happy to see a dummy. This is a few years ago, and go through it. And this is in the archive in Lely. And this is a work of Philip Guffler. He does this quilts. And he did interview the partner, the same partner of Wiesmals, and made a story, because he was very attracted to how these people were so strong at the time, making this institute work and doing what they wanted to do. And this is really a project by Aref Riyahi, where she made this fold object that could lead you to things in the archive, like using serendipity, how Like if you go to a library and you come from a book, and then at the end you're reading the book that was 2 steps to the right, and that's then your find. And this object was doing that. It was 2 months. People were performing, were dancing with the thing. It was really a beautiful project. I'm gonna name a lot of names because they're really important. That is Martin Laroche there. Also good to know. Yeah, there were talks. And all this working with this object made this really nice new combinations that weren't expected. This is Willem de Ridder did The Walk in 1980. That was the beginning of the Discman, Sony Discman. So he made a walk where he took people really through the Netherlands by bus and train and everything. And so it was cassette tape still. And there were 4 people, a few years ago, 4 people were invited to rewalk the walk with the same audio and see what happened. And it really worked well. And this is still open. Sometimes people come in and want to do the walk too. And then they can leave a trace on the website of the Appel to see what happened during this walk. So that's nice. But then I thought, it's also, you know, I'm the archivist. I'm holding these 800 boxes and 12,000 of books. I'm holding this around for a few times. I'll move it a lot and everything. So I'm also, you know, the archivist is a bit, you know, blind maybe. Because you know, everything for me is a thing, is data, is a thing in the archive, and it's important. So it has the same importance because it needs a space and it needs, you know, I think as an archivist. But so I thought, why it would be nice if it would be so important to have other people look at this archive and do their thing with it. And then I started with the remote archivist. It was also a wink to the invitation and the after invitation, so people could get it into their mailbox, really feel it and smell it. And then here you see the archivist working on the remote archivist, because you're a small institute, you have to put everything in the envelope and send it, and you know, the invisible work of an archivist. So this is the remote archivist. The first was a series of 3 by RFIDI coming from this fold object project. This is also something I think that happens in the archive. When you once dive into the archive, you will catch on other things and other projects will come out of this. So it's not a thing, going in like making art, going away, that's it. This is, okay, I will talk to this later. RFIDI, Martin Laroche and Maartje Vliervoet, coming from this fold object, making the story. That's the first remote archivist. It was just before COVID, so it was a coincidence. People were happy to receive things in their mailbox, especially that time. This is by Marta Jager, who dove into the postcard and the correspondence. And she revived correspondence with an artist that stopped in 1980 and contacted again the artist, and they were in a correspondence later. And this is this folded into a deeper research into the correspondence of the Appel. And Marta Jager and Hanna Cini, in this case, they dove into the correspondence, and they made a book about the correspondences to Appel, and it will be launched 12 December. It's 340 pages of correspondence. A choice from yeah, people coming in and having their take on what is the archive and what's important in this correspondence. Well, everybody's invited. I think it's one day before your opening, no? Yeah. Emma van Meijeren, so also the remote archivist is not only artists, it can be researchers. This is a Dutch writer, Emma van Meijeren, who dove into the feminist art exhibition. And this is Mariana, Lanari and Remco van Bladel, which I... So there's a lot of people coming from outside looking at this archive again, and I think this is also the case. It's really nice to tell maybe, oh, this is what comes back if you send out a remote archivist. Also nice. So one archive brings the other one. It grows and grows. Yeah, moving the archive. It is moving, it has been moving a lot, and this was for the, you saw the blue boxes already with archival consciousness to make the show catching up in the archive. Work, work, work. Getting all the books again and putting in boxes and getting it out again. And this we saw, of course, it's beautiful. It says we have the same picture. Yeah, it was really special to see the books from the top. It gives you so a different view on than in shelving. Yeah, we saw this remote, the Spaces Run archive. It's a really ideal dream, of course, because the container needs to be climatized and everything to have it right. But let's see. You never know. Okay, this is where I am now, because last week there were 2 storages, and they both at the same time ended the rent. So we had to find, like in the short term, a space again for the archive. So which is not the library part and the first step into the archive, but this is really the correspondence, the poster collection, the reel videos, audio reels and everything. This is only the first batch. And I wanted to say something about that. Like first, there's this, like in a small institute, it's nice that Clémentine showed the 2 different archives, you know, the reserves and then the film blocks. And then I think in a small institute, what happens is that there's no reserves for the archive, you know. It goes together with the wall that has been built, or, you know, everything gets together. And then Marjolein showed us around here, downstairs, and you made this nice book of for Paul, the book Paul, with Lien. Because in the small institute, because you don't have the space, everything comes together again. For the public, it's like, oh, this is the archive, and this is the exhibition. But in the dungeons again, then it comes all together. So the archivists really also know the walls and the chairs, and they're always in the way, you know, to get to your books. There's the chairs. So next week, we're going to build the shelving and put it in. The nice thing is it's only 2 blocks away from the Appel. So I can walk there with people and we can go get deeper in the archive if people want to. And so, yeah, I wanted to say there's a lot of invisible work. And the invisible work never gets funded. Like really the work in the archive. There's a lot of nice projects that get funded and everything, but like really sitting down and putting the things, you know, making a data record of it. There's never money for that. And what is also really important, I think, is to have it, like in the Netherlands, you count visitors. Like for this show, we had 20 visitors, or I don't know, 200 visitors. But really, archivists made it a point to count the time that people are in. And I think this is changing because it's more important if people run in and there's books, but if they stay 2 hours and come back the next day and to so have this time. And I think it's also changing in exhibition making and making longer workshops and coming together to discuss things and to learn things. So I think it also needs another way to count the longevity of how long people stay. Oh yeah, I've got one thing. Remote archivist. I do it with Bladel. He's the house style designer of the Appel. And yeah, correspondence books also made by Bladel and Susanna Kostelanska. I just want to say it because I always forget. Yeah, small archives. Yeah.
So is there anybody who has a question for one of the speakers? None? So you...
Not formulated very, very elaborate, but I was thinking with regards to the archival consciousness, yeah? No? Yeah? That is sort of creating a bigger and bigger archive overview, links, let's say, between all these different archives, inevitably incomplete. And I was also thinking of the Borges syndrome, no, the one-to-one world, where everything is, let's say, eventually becoming the world, no? And then we don't have to, well, that's anyway the future, we don't have to be there anymore. And then the archive can live on. But it's like, I find it really, maybe this is where my lack of formulation. No, somehow, okay, everything is sort of becoming more and more administered, becoming more and more present, digitally present as well. So is there a moment that you expect a collapse of this enormous body of data? Maybe that's a rhetorical question, and what would you do about it?
Thank you, Lisbeth. Yeah, that's interesting, and this perspective of the whole, right? Because in fact, it's mostly a movement, archiving, and I also think that the archive is a space of resistance. So it's a space that stays a bit more, that continues a bit more, and I see more the archives in terms of, in a way, sort of a continuation that gets picked up by someone as mostly a storytelling device or a place for stories than a place for completion. And in fact, let's say from the Appel we have basically the books, so it's also always a little bit less and is always a little bit behind. So it's mostly, I think, a process and an exercise and a place where we hang out. So that's also why the exhibition was called Catching Up in the Archive, because it also feels like you are in the middle of these shelves and all of these books, but in fact, it is really a place a bit like a garden or like weaving, and there is no completion because, and that's why we were calling last year's Archiving the Present, because in a way the archive is mostly a place where we can read again or that the events continue for some time. Because in the cultural institutions, everything goes so fast, there are so many events. And as you said, the exhibition could stay for a whole year or 2 years, and you can never exclude what is there. And I think is true as well, let's say from a frame or back that almost closed, I was expecting to read and to revisit a lot of things. So we don't have time, so we are in such an acceleration. So in the archive, I think we are just trying to delay a little bit the decay of all of these things. And in the case what we do, it's not also an idea of accumulation, but it's mostly an idea of relationality also, and one these ideas of that through one archive you enter the other and try to create a bit of a parallel environment where we can actually read what we want to read without being surveilled, without being tracked. You know, trying to sort of like work with these ethics of the library or the public library, the public archive, a place for studying, a place for writing, and yeah, reading, thinking. So not as much for, yeah, there is no complete archive at all. Yeah, but it is recursive. So the archive fits in a book, which opens up an archive. Every article opens up 30 articles. So I think that it also imitates, the archive also reproduces this cycle of basically transmission, dissemination, learning, and yeah.
Thank you so much for the presentations. My name is Agustina, and I was wondering, because you have different practices, and you were referring to the archive also in different terms. I mean, before it was like the collection, the archives, the holdings, but also you had the bibliograph and the idea of the library, and you, Isabel, I think you were talking about material traces of history, or what's an archive? I mean, in the sense of, is a box full of things an archive? I mean, I've seen a lot of texts about like, that's an archive, do you have a definition for yourself? What makes an archive, a collection, traces of history? Yeah.
Do you want to answer first? I don't mind. Okay. I think that a collection is not the same thing as an archive. I think that if you have, in the museum I was running, I had 70,000 objects. If you put together the collection Vanitas of German ethnographic museums, you hit on 5 million artifacts that have been removed from elsewhere for whatever reason. It's a heavy, loaded, annoying kind of accumulation. Whereas an archive and the archival turn, which is what we're in, is much more fluid. What I wanted to, so I don't know if that's not a good answer, because actually I don't think it's about scale, and yet somehow the very fact is that more young art students and curators are working on the archival. I have the impression they are, and they're not directly wanting to subvert collection taxonomies and collections as such. So I think there's more guardedness. There are more people gatekeepers and more experts on specialism around collections, whereas in the art world, which we're all operating in, the archive is more accessible somehow. But it's also, don't you think, it's very much caught in time. Like when I look at Appel, I see the book Graz, 1988. I know it. I see Marco Lehanka. I don't hear about him anymore. I know him. You know, you find things that are part of your generation. And I just want to raise another issue, which I didn't talk about, but which concerns me, and that is the increasing interest by top galleries in artists' archives, in artists' estates, and the money behind archives, and the question of publishing. Because what you have in the Appel is you have these extraordinarily magical pamphlets and mail art and all kinds of catalogues that were produced, which is totally different to the way publishing operates today. Totally different. You know, the idea of an artist's organ, back to the organ, is something that is not just one more book about Caspar David Friedrich or about Gerhard Richter, or it's not just another book. It's something that is needed to communicate without the straitjacket of a particular structure, a particular format. Artists and writers create organs when they need to voice their own ideas. And I think that if we could imagine collections like that too, in other words, is there a collection that can be produced that is an organ? How do we do that? That's what I was talking about when I mentioned Bless. Would they go so far as to fracture their own biography, their own archive, and create a new institution with a new collection that was made out of these fragmented parts that were crucial to their own
hagiography, their own history, basically? And the answer is no, of course they wouldn't do it. They removed it and took it back, and it sits neatly in their archive. So there's a kind of a fetishism about it and a convention to the archive, which is just even greater with the collection. And I don't know what to do about the relationship between money and collections and money and archives. And I think it's an important one to talk about the value of these things. Because they can't have a value unless they circulate. There is no way of knowing the exact value of, for example, Documenta Archive, where I work. I'm working with them, and I looked through several blocks of material. But how can I tell you that David Hammond's letter to Jan Hoot at a certain moment is worth so much? It's only if it's released, if it's either stolen or deaccessioned. And I think this is an important issue around the value, the way we value archives. Otherwise, we remain terribly academic and a little bit, precious about what the archive is. How do we make it circulate and change its value system? How do we do that today without falling into the trap of artists' estates being bought by Hauser and Wirth or whomever, right? How do we evaluate archives beyond just being neatly boxed and brilliantly catalogued and this kind of thing? How do we think the future archive? How do we think what a future collection would be?
Maybe also to answer your question as well, maybe I'll borrow from Dodi Bellamy again, because I think what struck me so much about that passage was that her personal archive, or her personal collection rather, was in the process of becoming an archive. So this kind of proximity to the materials that she shared her whole life were being taken over by a bureaucratic institutional body. And what does that mean to the personal side of things? But I think what I take from that is also that an archive is when different personal materials are put in relation to each other, that when there is a kind of network of other actors, that Dodi Bellamy's personal collection goes into the Bennica Library that has other personal collections of other poets from the San Francisco Renaissance, does that begin to paint a larger social picture? And I think for me the question of collection or personal collection versus archiving is something to do with the transfer that happens in that moment. And it makes me think of an artist called Rita Keegan, who I had the privilege to work with a few years ago. And I went to visit her in London, and she was telling me about in the 1970s, she was employed at the Women's Art Index in London. And at the time, she was the only black woman working in the archive, and found the archiving that was happening there to be both discriminatory and also just minimising to the scene of women's art in London. So when she was there, she started a secondary archive within the archive, relatively in secret, that was dedicated to black women artists from the UK, and built this over a number of years. And then when she left the job, she took the archive with her. And she received a letter from the administration that she had stolen the archive, which is a very particular qualification for what she did. But she responded to that by saying that she felt that the context of this archive couldn't be preserved within a white institution, and that it needed to be relocated for the posterity of the archive. And this has really informed my thinking a lot about context. I think I said the word context like 10 times in my talk. But how you maintain this kind of social network around materials is, for me, somewhere where it shifts from the personal archive to the archive that is being built for some kind of social good in a way. But I agree the terms have been used loosely throughout the day, definitely by myself, but archiving, to me has some kind of, it gets you outside yourself, I guess, at some point, maybe.
I would also like to add something that really struck my mind also about Clémentine's talk. You mentioned this quote, and the archive is a fabrication. I think it was from the book, The Archive Will Not Restore You, and the archive is your what you're doing before you know you're doing it, and before you know what you're doing or what is at stake. That really struck me also because I termed myself as an archivist by accident, because I also didn't know what I was doing before I was doing it already. And so I think this idea of fabrication is also very important, because at least for institutions and for Frame of Frame, the archive is also what we use to create a narrative about ourselves as an institution, and something that I think is also maybe a little bit interesting as a digital-born archive is that you can actually rewrite a lot of stuff. I'm not saying I do it, but it is possible, because there isn't the trace in the same way. Obviously, if you were really dedicated, I'm sure you could find it, but and the way you present it, either visually through bibliograph or a website or another way, it also adds to this meta-narrative and kind of shaping a definition of the organization. So I really lean more towards this idea that it's a fabrication, and also what Mariana mentioned, that it's always in progress. You're never finished. It's constantly constantly doing it, or it's kind of sitting on the back burner for a long time, and so it's still in the process of being written as well.
Yeah, and I want to add, and then I see you, Nienke. And I think one of us, that thing that binds us, is that we really want to make it public. We want to engage with the public, not that they just look at it, but that they come and engage with what we have in our archives. I think that makes an archive. And a collection, it's more like a display. A selection is taken and that is displayed. Well, we want people to engage with our archive, even the obscure things we might not find interesting ourselves. I think I archive a lot, but I think, like, for me it's not interesting, but maybe somebody else will like it. So I had like a person who wanted to see all our posters, to see not the graphic design, but the commercial effect it had. It was an economy student. I would never have thought that somebody would do that type of research in the archive. But that's what makes an archive interesting, instead of collection, what people do with it. And that's also, I think, something we all want, is that people do something with our archives. No?
Yes. Hi, I'm Maaike, and I'm also an accidental archivist. I'm an artist, and I started a side job at Mama, which is just across the street, and I'm office manager there. And then a month after I started, our storage unit got cancelled, and everything was brought into the office and sort of needed to go somewhere. So I kind of started to look, what do we have? What do I do with that? So I kind of have like a really practical question, like how do you handle an archive that has hardly been kept? It has many, many gaps. Like sometimes we have like 200 flyers, and then we have years where I have like nothing. And I also have like, you can see like sometimes someone was there who was like enthusiast, like I am maybe, you know, and then I find like an hour each week to do something with it. But sort of, how do you even start, you know, if you have like not necessarily a lot of knowledge or access, and what do you bring in again also? So I also have this idea that I want to ask our public to bring back, you know, Mama is an institution that has been now almost 30 years in Rotterdam. So there's probably a lot of things that people have. So I'm kind of thinking about, well, how do you make an archive again? How do you make it happen? Yeah.
I don't think we should underestimate how important it is to work with architects who think about these things. They don't. When museums are built at the moment, they still follow the same boring structure. You know, you walk in, Casa on the left, shop bookshop on the right, a series of rooms, the toilets downstairs with a cloakroom, it's the cafe, it's all so standard. And it's terrible to see how it then leaves a mark on older buildings and the way that directors of institutions continue to use that matrix and don't change it. There's nothing to stop, because I do think that, first of all, I don't think collections have to do with display, because the majority are not on display, and the majority nowadays, scenographers are more important than the objects. And so when you're looking at cultural historical collections or exhibitions, you will see far less objects than you would have seen maybe 20 years ago. You see more scenography, more images, more kind of pointless structures that are neither art nor not art. They're just kind of scenographers having a good time, costing a lot of money. You ask young curators, what do you think the budget for scenography should be? And they will say without thinking, 50%? And then, so where is the artist production costs? And anyway, what is all this? What is all this scenography at the moment? It's crazy. Yeah, it's totally over the top. We don't need it. Artists don't need to have scenographers to install their works. And this is also part of the disappearing of the archive. It's disappearing, and the collections are being standardized in big warehouses so that you don't have to pay so many people. So why aren't architects and the ones who are either creating private museums or state museums, why aren't they enabling civic education within their collections and within their spaces? And why aren't they asking people to think of ways like you did, very intelligent? I love the little mobile units for scanning books. I love them. But everything has to be on wheels, and you have to be able to move these things around. And, and then you have to nurture not only respect, we need respect in relation to the history of these things, but we also need to think of good questions. We need to, in order to find out what to do with these archives, we have to ask new questions. And I think that for me to be able to go to maybe 15, 20 museums in Brussels and ask them if they have any traps, I couldn't believe how successful it was. I maybe wouldn't use the same idiom if I was doing the same show in Sydney or in Paris. Maybe I would have to find a different idiom. But we need to begin to think not just of the archive as a worthy space to research, but as a place where we can engage with our imagination differently and create new junctions that are, dare I say it, definitely more decolonial than if we follow the roots of the past, especially if we're not working within the art context. But if we take on the archives and collections of all these museums around us here that are sort of just becoming places for mass tourism, right? So what do we do with all this stuff? Are we not interested in it? It is not sexy to get involved in the archive of a natural history museum, right? It's got, oh no, I don't want to look at all this stuff. It's problematic. But this is the crux of it. This is where, if we're not careful, it'll all be locked up, it'll disappear, and we won't even think that it's important. And then you'll have a place like the depot or the store warehouse where you think you're getting something, but in fact you're just being duped into believing that this is a democratic space. But we need the nurturing of a democratic intellect inside museums. And for that, we must make use of collections, and in particular, secondary collections. I don't want to see another masterpiece. I don't go to museums because I'm not interested in reading and watching scenographic trajectories. But I definitely don't want to see a Caravaggio with 13 spots on it in a room with hundreds of people and their handies. So show me the stuff that no one is interested in. Because I can guarantee you the younger generation are more interested in that, in this other secondary weird stuff, and hunting for it and looking for it, than in being told that they should put together a neo-historicist exhibition of some dead artist. Yeah, I'm sorry. But we have a responsibility to address the collections and the archives that are not sexy anymore. We really do.
Yeah, I wanted to also, because one of the questions would also be, because the MAMA collection, which is missing things, because there's also something happening already there, people making exhibitions, inviting artists, and then doing it for 2 months. And don't think about, like, in the 2 months, this is important, and then after we don't need the invitation or the pictures anymore. So I think it's already starting there with the making of, to find it important enough to keep that, to make to keep it. Yeah, just only to have it already, like not making it redundant after the show is closed. That's crazy. And then I also think that an archive like the Bless archive, that artists keep a better archive because it's so personal. And that's I think that making the big archives and putting all the archives together, I don't think it's going to work. I think the smaller you keep the archives and then platform, to connect them and to make this other kinds of connections and networks, to show these networks, is that might work better than thinking we can do the whole thing.
Maybe also, I absolutely agree that the building of an archive should be thought architecturally as well. But of course, that's not a question that relates to MAMA. I think as a small organisation, that probably struggles with the same question of storage as we do at A Tale of a Tub. When Mariana asked me to do this talk, I also thought, like Mariana, that there's no archive at A Tale of a Tub. And only on the prompt did I think actually about the archival practices that are already in place at the institution that I maybe inherited accidentally or simply just we began doing as a team through how we're organising our work. So maybe just a simple, practical piece of advice is to just spend some time analysing what processes are already in place, because they are. And it might be, a Google Drive storage, it might be the volunteers. I think that the volunteers and the hosts usually carry the most knowledge of an institution. But to just look at what's already happening, because we are, for some reason, compelled as humans to be doing this kind of thing, building personal collections or archives or otherwise. But I can guarantee it's probably already happening, and also that the gaps themselves reveal other forms of information, that working toward finding every poster that's ever been produced isn't necessarily the only way to think about building the archive, that actually maybe there's a gap because a staff member had a fallout or their computer died, or these kinds of more material realities of an institution are actually revealed in the absences. And then, the question then is, how do you archive those things? But we can keep talking about it, because I think we're in similar positions.
Yeah, and I want to add to that, when making the exhibition upstairs, it was for me, I'm also usually busy just putting things in their right boxes. I mean, that's just the thing you need to do as an archivist. But then I had an opportunity to take a step back and look what's really everywhere. What do we have? And then you also see your things that are missing. But that's also interesting. Like, why do we miss this? Why is a whole area of Africa not in our artist overview? Why do we only have 3 people from India while 1/5 of the population lives there? I mean, all those questions also can be raised and can also sort of make you aware of your institute history in a different way. So the gaps are really just as interesting as all the filled parts. But it is really about just starting to look, what do I have and what do I miss? And yeah.
But imagine how much we're not going to be daring to look at. Foreign exchange, where we worked on a bunch of boxes of colonial photography, appalling material that had been hidden in the museum, shoved under a desk for many years, including about 150 photographs of close-ups of penises. Do you remember?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, taken from different people who had all landed in Sumatra on a plantation at the late 19th century. I don't think I could have done this exhibition today. I don't think it would be possible to discuss the really problematic material because people would say it's too painful, it can't be shown, there are too many rules and parameters today that we didn't have 10 years ago when we were working there. We had a freedom of movement. And I think that we need to remember that whether it's Rita Keegan, who I know too, and who it's very charming that you bring her up, it was an emancipatory archive at the time. And I think there's something about a sort of a morbid archive and an emancipatory archive. And I think the same applies to collections. And I despair at times that there isn't, again, I repeat it, more subversion, more demonstrations, more demands placed on museums to literally make these collections accessible. And I'm not talking about, changing the Tropen Museum so it looks a bit different and having an institute and doing nice exchanges and dialogues and using the right terms. I'm saying bring the stuff up. Like the dirty water has to come up at one point and we have to look at it. And I'm convinced, because I take students into these reserves, that the students know what they will select. And they don't need people of my generation or, or the curators with a specialism to tell them what they should be looking for. They have to be given the access, and this access, the rights of access into these collections today is for me fundamental. And so I love all the work around the archive, and it's fascinating. But you need to be a little bit, first of all, you need to have the right education to figure out how to work in an archive, whereas a collection is a mass of stuff that ultimately requires of you, first of all, a certain visual readiness. And that's why artists are good in collections, because they have a visual education. Yeah? And you can't tell me an anthropologist necessarily is visually educated. It's not true. So there are lots of professional barriers that need to be kind of chiseled at before we enter into a type of digital world, because we're not talking enough really about the digital archive at all. Yeah, we're in our old nostalgia. It's all nostalgic. Even if you make it, you render it within a digital idiom. The fact of the matter is that today we've only, me too, only spoken, apart from you, about this, the what we had, what we remember, what we retain, and what we loved.
What we can touch.
And what we can touch or read in a book, or, yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think also...
We're going to have the mic, because we're recording. And I just want to add that I often get people, they are surprised when I say they can visit the archive. They're like, but I'm not a researcher. And I'm like, no, that doesn't matter. Everybody can visit.
I would be very curious to hear everybody say something about throwing away and excluding, because there's limits to just spatially and in many ways. And it's also a big part, I think, of collecting and archiving. The things you don't include, the things you decide to throw away.
I reply quickly because I talk too much, and then I pass on, I won't say anything. I think that collections and archives need to be consciously de-accessioned. I think we need money for institutions. I think if you decide that you're going to put something onto the market, you enable an educational program to take place through that de-accessioning process. And I think there's a taboo around de-accessioning which is mad, absolutely mad. So rather than throw things in the dustbin, I would say, let them circulate. See what happens. Where do they go? What kind of huge debates will they throw up? And do it before the powerful galleries come in and buy the stuff off you.
That's decommission the microphone.
In terms of throwing away, I'm not sure how much I can say because I think in terms of the digital, it for us at least maybe depends on space, data space, and I don't think we've reached the limit yet, so it's not a conversation that will happen. I think there is very much cultural and I think personal obsession with keeping everything. So it's very hard to say what would be thrown away. I think it's more what I mentioned before, that there's editing going on continuously. So in light of new information, often previous entries are edited to kind of reflect that. So it's also very relevant for the project Archiving the Present that it's still happening. So I haven't thrown anything away yet. But oh yes, like physical, the artworks, that's a very interesting question actually. Like I said, we actually recycle a lot of material when it comes to artworks. I don't know if anyone else has this, that contractually you're obliged to destroy artworks if depending on the limitations of when they can be shown, or we try and return as much to the artist as possible, but they also have a limit on storage space. I've had a few cases where we try and return artworks and they say you can throw it away because I don't actually have the space for this anymore. I don't know if that's too TMI behind the scenes.
What I wanted to say is that people would get surprised that the main thing that many archivists do is actually to select what can stay, and in most cases archives are always dealing with space, so they are also yearly eliminating things or throwing things, or even always in a way. So, and also things you eliminate, everything, there's always traces back in the archive. And I also wanted to say that I find it really interesting that we are having a symposium about archives also with curators, because the whole idea of an archive is understood in so many ways. Like if we would ask everyone here in the room to define what is an archive, we would possibly have the same number of different ideas and definitions about it. So I also think we deal with different layers of the archive. So, and Nell can say this, so although in our case we do deal a lot with objects that are material, but also data, for us is always, in a way, what's left. And it's always about the archive as being your memory as a space. So the things of the archive, they become mostly like a mediation of a story, or a way to access a story or something, which is always partial and incomplete.
Yes, I can add that to that you also, like an archivist, we have like a list of things you can throw away straight away that never enter the archive. For example, that you bought pens, all those sort of mundane things we usually throw away because nobody's interested that on Thursday 1992 you bought 3 paper clips. At least I think a lot of people won't be interested in that. So that's already... And then we have all the things that are not really our information, like if you ask for a subsidy. Subsidy applications are very important for our archive, because then the curators have to really say what they are doing in an exhibition. The whole idea behind an exhibition has to explain. So subsidy requests or applications are a big part of our archive. But I don't need all the rules of the application, because they're already in the archive of the funding body. So that's how you select. But what it's also important, what Mariana says, you keep what tells a story. You keep what you think is going to tell something about how to make an exhibition, how the artist was thinking, how those thoughts changed in the process. I think those are the things you really want to keep. And with the digital, indeed, you have the thing that, like, we use 5% of our space. We have digital. So I never have to worry about saving something that's unimportant. But what you do have to worry about is, do I keep doubles? Because that will mix the idea. And is it still findable? Or do I have so many useless documents that it's becoming, you have everything, but in reality you have nothing because you can't see the forest because of all the trees in front of your face. Ooh, there was a question somewhere.
Well, first of all, thank you all for the brilliant talks. And my name is Mathieu. Clémentine, I cannot help but to think about Fred Wilson and his Mining the Archive when you said to bring the dirty water up, to make these things be seen, etc. But during your talk, you also said that when it comes to labeling, you see that sort of as a disempowerment of the viewer, because that just guides. But again, coming back to Fred Wilson, I'm just thinking that a lot of people and later a lot of outlets and publications have attributed the whipping post that he used in the exhibition to the slavery era, which was not true, and it created a lot of criticism against how Wilson used labeling in his exhibit, while allowing people, to roam freely and make sense of the things themselves. I think it also brings important question about the decoding end of these bringing dirty water up exhibitions, because then, as you said, you don't need any education to walk into the museum, but then you do have the capacity to react to these things and to also create the narrative around it. So basically my question boils down to, how would you define and how would you understand this fine line between, guiding and helping, and being over patronizing over the viewer to not make them make sense of the dirty water that's coming up? Thank you.
I teach at the academy in Brussels, and I showed the film of Onyeka Igwe to my students, or they looked at it yesterday, or day before yesterday, and at the end of it, they loved it. They were crazy about that film. They also looked at the Mati Diop film, Daomé, and then the great film by Kwateni Owu, You Hide Me, from the 70s. And the three films, that was the task. At the end of it, even though these are art students, they came up with, they said, yes, but the problem is it's not very accessible what Onyeka Igwe has done. So we're going through a period where the idea of accessibility has become so dominant that the role of the artist in cleaning up the dirty water is actually secondary in a lot of curatorial thinking. That you can invite an artist and they'll do a residency and they'll do something, and maybe it's about the Benin bronzes or whatever, but there is a kind of dominant vision at the moment that art is per se inaccessible, and that therefore it requires support. It requires semantic prosthetics, as if it had lost its leg. It needs to be propped up. It needs QR codes. It needs plain English. It needs to have a sort of idea of accessibility that completely disempowers the role of the artists and why they make work,
and the importance of encoding work as an artist, not just curatorial decoding of a work, but the importance that why we look at artworks is not to have everything explained away. You know, read your Rancière, as I'm sure you have. Explanation is ideological, like conservation, it's ideological. So it's super important, I think, to create exhibitions like the one upstairs of Joanna. Did I get the right? Donna, thank you. Where I looked at this work, I didn't know it at all. And then suddenly I found, oh, there's no big text to tell me what it is. I had to go back into the corridor, and then I read something. So I was given the benefit of the doubt that, you know, that maybe I would actually enjoy looking at the work before I was being given a massive amount of prose written by an anonymous person, because you don't author wall texts. And I think that, so the Fred Wilson time in the 80s, and the kind of scenario we're in today is polar opposites. You know, even if he created a travesty of something, his work in the museum is regarded as seminal, yeah. And these, I don't know how to put it, but this is all part of what I think we have to look at, and that is ways of encouraging visitors to form new meanings, to allow a proliferation, a flourishing of interpretation. And how you do that is maybe to give them the chance to actually spend more time in a space. That's why I insist on furniture, to sit down, to have stuff to look at that no one cares about because it's not a masterpiece. And there's so many rules and regulations now in even lending educational collections from the 1940s. I tried to borrow teaching collections on how to build a bomb in the 1940s. These are panels which show you how to make triggers, covered in fly shit, you know, totally forgotten in the bottom of the storage of one of the big museums in Brussels. Next to it, blue balls of different shapes that are pure heavy steel. You can barely lift them up. They won't lend them to us at KANAL because they don't want to shift them. And yet these are things that have no value whatsoever in the scheme of things and that will never be looked at. So I'm not giving you a straight answer in any way, but I just feel that on the one hand, we have to reinstate the artist and talk about the role of artists in archives. We really do. We don't talk enough about artists. Curatorial education has pushed them to the side in favor of a kind of restaurant menu of how to make an exhibition where you put the works in the right order and that's it. Yeah, no, it's true. Artists are not engaged. Artists are being told to do certain things and have a narratology built around them, and it has to be easily comprehensible and God knows, you know, I mean, I don't get it anymore. And I come back to this question again of scale. I don't understand today why artists have to make such huge works. Why? And I want to bring one artist up who I find quite problematic, but who fits in neatly in what we're discussing, and that's Ibrahim Mahama, a 35-year-old artist who's building a museum of vast kleptomania of everything that he can get, who sends his assistants out in Ghana to go and buy all the shoe shining boxes in the markets that he can possibly buy, and then presents them along with all his Singer machines, along with all this the kente cloth, with the blueprints. Yeah, you know, what is going on there? Is he doing something really intelligent? Yes, he's building a museum, his own museum, by appropriating a Western notion of a cumulative collection. But at the same time, you think, there's a sort of you know what I mean? So how do you compare a guy like Mahama building this stuff in Tamale, which is, you know, not exactly a buzzing town center, far away in the north of Ghana. You have to fly to it, or it takes 8 hours in a bus to get there. What is that thinking in the context of the archive and the collection? I think there's a lot of we have to work on that, and that's why a conference like this is so exciting, because it pushes us also to respect the past, and at the same time to have to be kind of iconoclastic towards it.
So, thank you for those words. Is it working? Yeah, it's working. Thank you for these words, and I think we end with the flourishing interpretation. I think that's really something I enjoy. It's already past 5, so I think we should continue our discussion downstairs with nice drinks. And I want to thank everybody on the panel and our keynote speaker for a very interesting and invigorating afternoon. Thank you.